Act 1, Chapter 1. The apartment at the end of the block had a light in the window most nights, but nobody ever asked why a 6-year-old was the one turning it on. Naruto Uzumaki knew the rules of his street the way other children knew nursery rhymes. Knock twice before entering the grocer's, because if you walked in too fast, Old Man Tuchi's neighbor would accuse you of stealing before you had even reached the shelf. Never make eye contact with the woman who ran the flower stand. Always leave the academy by the side gate, because the front gate was where the parents waited, and waiting parents had a way of pulling their children a little closer when they saw him coming. He was good at the rules. He had needed to be. Nobody had ever sat him down and taught him where the orphanage's east wing bathroom was, or which merchant would still sell to him after dark, or how to boil rice without burning it black on the bottom of a pan too big for his hands. He had worked those things out alone, the way he worked out everything, by getting them wrong first and remembering the mistake. The Hokage's tower stood at the center of the village like the trunk of some enormous tree, and everyone else got to be a branch of it. Naruto had learned early that he was not a branch. He was something growing in the shadow of the trunk, tolerated because uprooting him would have made more noise than leaving him be. He did not think of it in those words. He was 6, then 7, then 8, and each year the specific cruelty faded a little into a general, low weather that he stopped noticing the way you stop noticing a smell you have lived inside long enough. The academy instructors called on him last, if they called on him at all. His written test came back marked in red ink that seemed personally offended by his handwriting. When the class practiced kunai throwing in pairs, he was always the odd number, and Irika Yumino, still new to teaching then and not yet the man who would matter to him, would pair himself with Naruto without comment and without warmth, a duty discharged rather than a kindness offered. His birthday came on the 10th of October every year, and every year the village found a way to be busiest on that particular day. Shops closed early. Neighbors he barely knew found reasons to visit relatives outside the walls. He had stopped asking why by the time he was 7, not because he had stopped wondering, but because the not knowing had become its own kind of company. He spent that day, every year, sitting on top of the Hokage monument with a rice ball he had made himself, looking down at a village that had decided, without ever holding a vote he could have attended, that today was a day to look away from him. The third Hokage knew. That was the part that Naruto, even at 8, understood with the flat clarity children sometimes have about the adults who fail them. Hiruzen Sarutobi knew his name, knew his birthday, knew, Naruto suspected, more about why the village flinched from him than he had ever said aloud. And still the old man let him live alone in an apartment with a landlord who raised the rent whenever he felt like it, let him walk to the academy through streets that parted around him like water around a stone, let him grow up mostly by accident, the way a weed grows in a crack in the pavement, not because anyone chose to plant it there, but because nobody had gotten around to pulling it up. There were kindnesses, small and sparing. Tuchi at the ramen stand never overcharged him, and sometimes, on nights when Naruto's coin purse came up short, forgot to charge him for the extra bowl. The old woman who sold umbrellas once gave him one for free during a downpour, muttering something about how a boy shouldn't have to choose between staying dry and eating dinner. These moments mattered to him disproportionately, the way a single warm room matters more in winter than in summer, and he collected them the way other children collected toys, turning them over in his mind on the nights the apartment felt too big for one small boy and too quiet for anyone to hear him if he cried, which he had mostly stopped doing by 8, not because it hurt less, but because crying had never once brought anyone through the door. He was, in every measurable way that the adults around him cared to measure, a disappointment. His grades were poor. His chakra control was worse. He was loud in a village that preferred its shinobi quiet, and eager in a village that had decided eagerness in him was something to be suspicious of rather than something to nurture. What none of them measured, because none of them were looking, was how a boy with no one to catch him had taught himself, out of sheer necessity, never to fall in a way he couldn't get up from alone. That November, 2 travelers passed through the village gates on their way to somewhere else, and neither of them had any plan to stay. Chapter 2. Tsunade of the Sannin had not set foot in Konoha in over a decade, and she had planned, on the morning she and Shizune arrived, to keep that streak alive for exactly 6 hours, long enough to collect a debt from a merchant who had been avoiding her letters, and not 1 minute longer. You said 4 hours, this morning, Shizune said, adjusting the strap of the pig carrier on her shoulder. Tonton grunted in what might have been agreement. It's already been 5, and we haven't even found the merchant yet. The merchant found somewhere better to be, Tsunade said, scanning the market street with the particular irritation of a woman who disliked being made to wait almost as much as she disliked the village she was waiting in. Which means we stay until he stops hiding, or until I get bored and start breaking things that belong to him instead. Shizune had heard variations of this threat for the better part of 15 years, and no longer found it alarming, mostly. She was more concerned with the way Tsunade's shoulders had gone tight the moment they passed under the village gates, the old grief sitting there the way it always did in this place, unspoken and unaddressed, and, Shizune privately suspected, never actually going to be either. It was the boy who broke the pattern of the day, though either of them knew it yet. He came around the corner of a narrow alley at a dead run, arms pumping, a look of fierce concentration on a face too young to be wearing it, and nearly collided with Tsunade's hip before some quick footwork on his part turned the collision into a graze. He staggered, caught himself, and would have kept running if Shizune hadn't reached out on reflex and steadied him by the shoulder. Sorry, I wasn't looking, he said, already trying to pull free, already braced. Shizune noticed, for something. His shoulders had come up around his ears the instant her hand touched him, the flinch of a child who had learned that contact with strangers rarely went well. You're bleeding, Shizune said, because she was a medic before she was anything else, and the observation came out of her before politeness could intervene. There was a shallow scrape along his forearm, fresh enough to still be welling, the kind of injury that came from scrambling over a fence or a wall in a hurry. It's nothing, the boy said, in the too quick, too practiced way of someone who had said that exact sentence many times before and meant it less each time. Tsunade, who had been 3 seconds from telling Shizune to let the child go so they could get back to the business of finding an evasive merchant, found herself looking instead. Not at the scrape, which was genuinely minor. At the boy's eyes, which were doing something she recognized instantly and did not want to, assessing the two of them, calculating whether this encounter was going to cost him anything, deciding whether it was safer to stay or run. She had seen that calculation before. She had made it herself, once, a very long time ago, in the weeks after Nawaki died and before she had learned to stop expecting kindness from strangers by default. Sit, she said, and something in her voice, gruff as it was, made the boy actually pause. Sit down before you bleed on your own shoes. I told you, it's nothing. And I told you to sit down. I didn't ask for your medical opinion, kid, I have one of my own, and it disagrees with yours. She crouched, which put her at something closer to his eye level, and held out a hand, palm up, waiting. He looked at the hand the way he might have looked at a trap. Shizune, watching, felt something in her chest twist, the particular ache of recognizing a wariness that had clearly been earned rather than invented. It won't hurt, Shizune said gently. She's the best medic in the elemental nations. You've basically won the lottery, getting scraped up in front of her. That got something out of him, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, quick and surprised, as if he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to find anything funny in the middle of being fussed over. He held out his arm. Tsunade's hand glowed pale green, and the shallow wound closed itself in under 2 seconds, skin knitting seamlessly back together. The boy stared at his own arm like it belonged to someone else. Whoa, he said, with the frank, unguarded delight of someone who had briefly forgotten to be careful. That's so cool. Are you really the best medic? What's your name? Tsunade, she said, straightening up, brushing dust from her knees. This is Shizune. And you are? Naruto. Naruto Uzumaki. I'm gonna be Hokage someday, so you should probably remember my name now, get a head start on everyone else. He said it with a grin that was several sizes too big for the moment, the kind of grin, Tsunade thought, that a person built specifically to survive being disbelieved. She had met 100 children who wanted to be Hokage. She had never met one who announced it like a challenge to the entire street. Uzumaki, Shizune repeated softly, and something passed between her and Tsunade, quick and wordless, the recognition of a name that had once belonged to a whole clan and now, as far as either of them knew, belonged to almost no one. That's right. Naruto puffed his chest out slightly, unaware of the weight the name carried for the two women in front of him. You want my autograph early? I'll probably be famous. I'll take a rain check, Tsunade said, and found, to her genuine surprise, that she meant it as something other than a brush-off. Chapter 3. They should have parted ways after that. Tsunade had a merchant to hunt down and a debt to collect, and a scraped-up child with an oversized grin was not, by any reasonable accounting, her problem. Instead, she found herself letting Naruto lead them to a ramen stand 2 streets over, mostly because Shizune had asked him, in the mild, curious way she asked most children questions, what he'd been running from in the first place, and he'd answered, nothing, I was just racing myself, with such immediate and practiced ease that both women understood at once it was a lie, and neither pushed. The old man running the stand, Tsuchi, greeted Naruto by name and with an easy warmth that told Tsunade this, at least, was a real relationship, however small. He fixed the boy a bowl without being asked twice, and only glanced at Tsunade and Shizune with mild curiosity, the look of a man used to Naruto turning up with strange company and not overly concerned about it. You come here a lot, Tsunade observed, watching Naruto eat with the single-minded focus of someone who did not take food for granted. Every day I can, he said around a mouthful of noodles. Tsuchi's the best. He doesn't, he stopped himself, shrugged, kept eating. He doesn't what? Nothing. Another lie, delivered with the same practiced ease as the first, though this one had a rawer edge to it, the kind of unfinished sentence that told her more than the finished one would have. He doesn't look at me funny. He doesn't charge me extra. He doesn't pretend not to see me. Tsunade could fill in a dozen endings, and none of them were the kind a child should have to reach for. Shizune, seated on Naruto's other side, was doing the quiet arithmetic that came naturally to her after years as a medic. The too thin wrists under a jacket clearly bought several sizes too big to last. The way he ate like the meal in front of him might be the only one for a while, the calluses already forming on small hands from what looked like self-taught training rather than academy instruction. None of it, on its own, was alarming. All of it together made a shape she didn't like. Do you live around here? Shizune asked. Yeah, couple streets that way. He gestured vaguely with his chopsticks. It's just me, though. I mean, it's fine. I've got it handled. Your parents? Tsunade asked, more bluntly than Shizune would have, though the question had been sitting in both their mouths. Naruto's chopsticks paused for half a second, barely noticeable if you weren't watching for it. Don't have any. Never did. It's fine, he said again, quicker this time, the sentence worn smooth from repetition. A stone he'd been carrying so long it had stopped feeling sharp to him, even if it still cut everyone who touched it for the first time. Tsunade said nothing. She had grown up with brothers, with a family, with a name that opened doors, and had still lost almost everyone she loved by the time she was Naruto's age in spirit if not in years. She knew what it cost to say it's fine about a wound that had never actually closed. She recognized the shape of that particular lie because she had told it herself, for decades, about Dan, about Nawaki, about the 2 graves she still could not bring herself to visit. How old are you? She asked instead. 8. I'll be 9 in a few months. He brightened, visibly relieved at the change in subject. You gonna be around for my birthday? Tsuchi always gives me a free bowl if I'm around on my birthday, actually, best day of the year. No arguments, I'm not gonna be here on it though, cause he stopped again. Started again, faster, papering over whatever he'd almost said. Anyway, doesn't matter. You guys just passing through? Something like that, Tsunade said, and hated, somewhere underneath the irritation she had walked into the village wearing like armor, how quickly the boy had learned to redirect a conversation away from anything that might make an adult uncomfortable enough to leave. She did not know, yet, that she was not going to make it back out through the gates on schedule. She only knew, watching Naruto polish off a second bowl with the same fierce, unguarded gratitude he'd shown for the healed scrape, that leaving today felt, suddenly, like the wrong kind of decision to make in a hurry. Chapter 4. We are not adopting a stray, Tsunade said 3 streets later, before Shizune had said a single word about it. I didn't say anything. You were thinking it very loudly. Shizune allowed herself a small smile, the kind she rarely showed when Tsunade was in one of her prickly moods, because prickly moods were usually a sign that something underneath had been disturbed and was doing its best not to show it. I was thinking that the merchant can wait another day. That's all. He's already waited 5 hours. He can wait until tomorrow. It's not like we have anywhere else to be. That much, at least, was true, and had been true for years. Tsunade and Shizune's travels were less a journey with a destination than a long, restless circuit away from a village that held too much grief in its streets, and toward gambling dens that held, at best, a temporary distraction from it. There was no schedule to keep. There had not been one in a long time. Tsunade didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the boy's wrists, and the too quick lie about his parents, and the way he'd caught himself twice mid-sentence like a person walking a floor he already knew had weak boards in it. She was thinking, too, though she would not have admitted it aloud, about a version of herself at 8 years old, before Nawaki's death and Dan's death had carved her down into someone harder, when she had still believed, the way children do, that the adults around her were fundamentally on her side. Fine, she said finally. We stay a few extra days. Collect the debt properly. Not because of the brat. Of course not. I mean it, Shizune. I know you do. They found a modest inn near the market district, and that evening, restless in a way she didn't examine too closely, Tsunade found her feet carrying her toward the Hokage Tower instead of toward the gambling den 3 streets over that had, in years past, reliably swallowed an evening's boredom whole. Hiruzen Sarutobi looked older than she remembered him, though it had been years, and years did that to a person regardless of how they were spent. He rose from behind his desk with genuine warmth when the guard announced her, the kind of warmth Tsunade had never quite managed to be immune to, not even after everything. Tsunade. This is an unexpected pleasure. He gestured her toward a chair. What brings you back to the village? A debt. Unrelated to you. She sat, arms crossed, studying him with the assessing eye she brought to every patient, every problem, every situation that smelled faintly of something being wrong beneath the surface. I ran into a kid today. Blonde, whiskered, loud. Says his name's Naruto Uzumaki. Something moved behind Hiruzen's eyes, quick and careful, the look of a man bracing for a conversation he had clearly been expecting for years and had hoped, against reason, to avoid a little longer. Ah, he said. Yes. I imagine you would have questions. I have exactly one. Why does an Uzumaki, in this village, of all villages, look like he hasn't had a decent meal that wasn't ramen in longer than I want to think about? Hiruzen was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet Tsunade heard, more clearly than any answer could have told her, that whatever excuse he offered next was going to be a poor one, and that he already knew it. His situation is complicated, the old man said at last. There are reasons the village keeps its distance from him. Reasons I cannot fully explain, even to you, without breaching a confidence that isn't only mine to keep. That's not an answer, Hiruzen. That's a dodge with better posture. I know. He looked, for a moment, genuinely tired, the weight of decades pressing visibly into the lines of his face. I have done what I can within the constraints I have. It has not, I am aware, been enough. Tsunade sat back, and something cold and clear settled into her chest, the particular clarity that came, in her experience, right before she decided to break something. Then it's a good thing, she said, that I'm apparently staying in the village a few extra days. Chapter 5. Shizune found the academy training grounds by asking 3 separate shopkeepers for directions, each of whom answered readily enough about the building itself and grew strangely vague the moment she mentioned Naruto by name, as though his existence were a subject better handled at a slight remove. She told herself she was only curious. She told herself the same thing again, more firmly, when she found a spot along the practice field fence with a clear view of a class of 8- and 9-year-olds running through kunai drills, and felt her curiosity sharpen into something closer to vigilance the moment she spotted Naruto near the back of the group. He was trying. That much was obvious even from a distance. His stance was clumsy but earnest, his throws inconsistent but improving with each repetition, the visible effort of a child who had decided, somewhere along the way, that trying harder was the only lever available to him. What struck Shizune, watching, was not the boy's clumsiness. It was everyone else's response to it. The instructor, a young man Shizune didn't recognize, moved down the line of students offering correction after correction, a hand adjusting a grip here, a word of encouragement there, patient and thorough with every single student. Until he reached Naruto. Then the pattern broke. He glanced at Naruto's form, said nothing, and moved to the next student as though the boy between them simply didn't require comment, good or bad. It happened again on the next pass. And the one after that. By the fourth round, Shizune understood she wasn't watching an oversight. She was watching a policy, unspoken but consistent, applied by an adult who had presumably never once been told directly to ignore the boy and had simply absorbed, from the water he swam in, that ignoring him was the safer choice. The other children had absorbed something similar. When the class broke into pairs for target practice, the shuffling and pairing off happened with the loose, easy chaos of children who trusted they'd land somewhere fine, until only Naruto was left standing, and the instructor, without any visible discomfort at the arithmetic, simply told him to practice alone against the farthest target. He did. He threw kunai at a target nobody was watching, correcting his own form by trial and error because no one else would correct it for him, and Shizune, watching from the fence, felt something in her chest go tight and hot in a way it hadn't in a long time. She stayed longer than she'd intended, watching the small, private economy of the training field, how the other children traded jokes and complaints and half-finished dares between throws, an easy current of belonging that none of them seemed to notice they were swimming in, and how Naruto worked in a silence that had nothing companionable about it, an island a few feet from the nearest shore and somehow, impossibly, further from it than the distance alone could explain. Twice, a stray kunai from another pair skittered near his feet and he retrieved it, and returned it without a word, and twice the owner took it back without a word either, the whole exchange conducted like a transaction between strangers rather than classmates who had shared a room 5 days a week for years. What unsettled Shizune most was how little anger she could find in him. A child treated this way for this long should, by any reasonable expectation, have curdled into something bitter, and instead he simply kept throwing, kept adjusting, kept trying, as though the absence of anyone's attention were a technical problem to be solved through effort rather than a wound that deserved to be named. She understood, watching him, that this was not resilience in the way people like to praise it. It was closer to a kind of quiet, exhausting survival, the sort that looked like strength from a distance and felt, up close, like something that had cost him more than anyone around him had ever bothered to notice. She thought of her own childhood briefly, the family she'd lost young enough that Tsunade had become something closer to a parent than an employer over the years that followed. She had been fortunate, she understood now, watching this. She had never had to learn, at 8 years old, how to be entirely her own advocate in a world built by people who had already decided the case against her. At the end of the session, as the other children scattered toward parents waiting at the gate or friends walking home in loose, laughing clusters, Naruto packed up his own kunai alone, methodically, the practiced efficiency of someone with no reason to hurry because no one was waiting for him regardless of the pace he kept. He spotted Shizune at the fence on his way past and brightened immediately, all the careful blankness of a moment before sliding off his face like it had never been there. "Shizune, you came to watch?" "I did." She smiled, though it took more effort than smiles usually did. "You've got a good arm. Your stance drifts a little on the follow-through though, you're leading with your shoulder instead of your hip." His eyes went wide. "Nobody's ever told me that before." "Well," Shizune said, and meant it as gently as she could manage while something in her was quietly, furiously rearranging its plans for the next several days, somebody should have. Chapter 6. He's being taught by omission, Shizune said that evening, pacing the small inn room while Taunton watched from the foot of the bed with the placid disinterest of an animal who had heard many arguments, and found none of them as compelling as dinner. "It's not that anyone's cruel to him, not exactly. It's that everyone's decided, without saying it out loud, that he doesn't merit the same effort as everyone else. An instructor who corrects every other student's form and skips his. Kids who don't even seem to notice they're leaving him out, because it's just how it's always been." "That's worse," Tsunade said low. Cruelty you can fight. This is a village that's collectively decided a child doesn't count, and nobody's even conscious enough of the decision to be ashamed of it. She had spent the afternoon making inquiries of her own, quiet ones, the kind that didn't require announcing herself as anything more than an old acquaintance of the Hokage's catching up on village gossip. What she'd learned had not improved her mood. Landlords who raised his rent without cause and got away with it because no council existed to hear the complaint of an 8-year-old with no advocate. A birthday, every year, that the village treated as an occasion to look elsewhere. A general, low-grade absence of care so consistent it had apparently become invisible to the people delivering it, the way a bad smell stops registering to anyone who's lived with it long enough. You're going back to see Hiruzen, Shizune said. It wasn't a question. I'm going back to see Hiruzen. Tsunade was already moving toward the door. She found him still at his desk, well past the hour most Hokages would have gone home, a stack of paperwork in front of him that he was not, she suspected, actually reading. He looked up when she entered and did not look surprised. I take it your inquiries were productive, he said. Don't do that. Don't sit there being resigned at me like this is a weather pattern you have no control over. You're the Hokage, Hiruzen. The whole point of the job is that you have control over exactly this kind of thing. I have some control, he said, and there was an old, tired steel in it that told her he'd had this argument with himself many times before she'd ever walked in to have it with him. I do not have unlimited control, and I do not have the ability to force an entire village to feel warmth toward a child they've been conditioned, by circumstances I am not free to fully explain, to fear. Fear. Tsunade's voice sharpened. He's 8 years old, Hiruzen. What in the world does an 8-year-old have that this village is afraid of? He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped, careful in the particular way of a man handling something that could shatter if mishandled. There are things about Naruto's circumstances that are classified at the highest level, by law, on pain of execution for anyone who reveals them without cause. I cannot tell you what they are, even now. What I can tell you is that the fear is not rational, and it is not his fault, and it is not, in any way, a fear he has earned. Tsunade studied him. She had known Hiruzen long enough to recognize when he was telling her the truth as far as it went, and when he was hiding behind the shape of the truth to avoid the substance of it. This, she decided, was the former. Fine, she said. Keep your law. I don't need to know the secret to know the result is unacceptable. So here's what's going to happen instead. I'm not leaving this village yet. And while I'm here, I intend to make myself very inconveniently present in that boy's life, whether the village finds that comfortable or not. Hiruzen looked at her for a long moment, and something in his tired face eased, just slightly, the particular relief of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for years and has just watched someone else, unbidden, reach out to take a corner of it. I would not stop you, he said quietly, even if I wanted to. And I do not want to. Chapter 7. Naruto answered his door the next morning to find Tsunade standing in the hallway with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she had already decided the outcome of whatever conversation was about to happen. You're not doing anything today, she said, before he'd even gotten the door fully open. Academy's out for the week, some instructor training thing, I checked. Which means you're free, and I'm bored, and those two facts are about to become one problem I'm solving. Naruto blinked at her, still in the oversized shirt he'd apparently slept in, hair sticking up in 6 directions. What? Get dressed. Bring water. We're going to a training field, and I'm going to find out exactly how bad your chakra control is, because I have a suspicion, and I don't like suspicions I haven't confirmed. He stared at her for a long moment, and Tsunade watched something complicated move across his face. Hope and suspicion tangled together so thoroughly that she wasn't sure the boy himself could have separated them. Why? He asked finally, quieter than his usual volume. Why do you care? It was a fair question, and it deserved better than a deflection, so Tsunade gave him the truth as plainly as she had it. Because yesterday I watched an instructor correct every other kid's form and skip yours like you weren't standing there. And because I don't like waste, and untrained potential is the worst kind of waste there is. Get dressed, kid. I'm not asking twice. He got dressed in under 2 minutes, which told her something about how quickly he could move when a reason presented itself. The training field she chose was a modest one, quiet at that hour, and she spent the first 30 minutes simply watching him work through basic exercises, chakra molding, tree walking, the elementary building blocks that most academy students had a rough handle on by his age and that he was attempting, she realized within minutes, almost entirely from instinct rather than instruction. Nobody's taught you the actual mechanics of this, she said, not a question. I figured it out from the textbook, Naruto said, a little defensively, as if bracing for criticism. Iruka-sensei explained it once in class, but I couldn't really, I got it eventually. Mostly. Tsunade crouched, put a hand flat against his stomach, and felt the chakra beneath her palm, wild, enormous, and almost entirely undisciplined, a river with no banks. It startled her, the sheer scale of it, though she kept her face carefully neutral. Whatever the boy's classified circumstances were, they had left him with reserves that had no business belonging to an 8-year-old. Your control is terrible, she said bluntly, and your reserves are absurd. Those two things together explain a lot about why you've probably burned yourself out trying basic exercises that should be easy. Oh. He deflated slightly. So I'm bad at it. You're untrained at it. There's a difference, and it's the difference that matters. She stood, brushing dust from her knees. Bad is a character flaw. Untrained is a problem I can fix in a few weeks if you're willing to work harder than you've ever worked at anything, including apparently keeping that grin on your face through everything this village has thrown at you. Something shifted in him at that, subtle but real, the particular straightening of a spine that happens when a child realizes an adult has actually noticed the effort behind the performance. I can work hard, he said, and there was no bravado in it this time, just a flat, fierce certainty. Nobody's ever really, okay. Yeah. Teach me. I'll do whatever you say. Good. Tsunade allowed herself something close to a smile, small and unfamiliar on her own face after so many years spent mostly scowling at cards and dice. Then let's start with why your chakra keeps escaping through your fingertips like you're trying to fling it at someone. Hands like this. He copied her seal, brow furrowed in concentration, and for the first time since arriving in the village, Tsunade found herself thinking that maybe 6 extra days wasn't going to be nearly enough time. Chapter 8. By the end of the first week, what had begun as a few extra days had quietly become something neither Tsunade nor Shizune had formally decided, but both had simply started living inside, the way a person moves into a house without ever signing anything, simply by unpacking one box and then another until there is no longer a version of leaving that doesn't require packing back up. Shizune took over Naruto's mornings while Tsunade slept off the previous night's card games, which she had resumed, though with noticeably less enthusiasm than before, as though some part of her preferred the training field to the gambling den now and hadn't yet admitted it to herself. Shizune taught him things nobody else had thought to: how to read a chakra signature for basic threat assessment, how to properly maintain a kunai edge, and more than anything, how to sit still in the company of an adult without bracing for the moment it would go wrong. You don't have to thank me every time I hand you something, she told him gently. The third time in one morning he'd said thank you for a cup of tea with the same startled gratitude he might have shown for a rare gift. Sorry, he said immediately, and then caught himself. Okay. I'll try not to. It's not a bad habit, Shizune said. It's just one I'd like to see you not need anymore. He didn't fully understand what she meant, not yet, but he filed it away the way he filed away most things people said to him, with any warmth, carefully, like something valuable he might need to take out and examine later. Tantan, for reasons Shizune found genuinely amusing, had taken an immediate liking to him, trotting after him around the small apartment they'd more or less adopted as a base of operations, and Naruto had taken to the pig with an enthusiasm bordering on reverence, sneaking her scraps from meals and insisting, with total seriousness, that Tantan was probably the smartest animal in the entire village. She's a pig, Naruto, Tsunade said one evening, watching him attempt to teach Tantan to fetch a stick. She's a genius pig, Naruto corrected. There's a difference. It was a small thing, that argument, absurd and inconsequential, and it made Shizune laugh out loud for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, the sound surprising even herself. Tsunade caught her eye across the room, and something passed between them, unspoken but entirely mutual. Either of them had planned this. Neither of them had any intention of planning this. And somehow, without either of their permission, it had happened anyway. They cooked dinner together most nights now, in Naruto's small apartment because it was closer to the training fields, and Shizune had quietly replaced the half-empty, mismatched cupboard contents with actual groceries without making a production of it, the way you might do a kindness for someone who would refuse it outright if you called attention to it. Naruto never commented on the sudden abundance of food in his kitchen, though Shizune noticed he ate slower now, less like a boy afraid the meal might vanish, and that, more than anything, felt like progress worth the trouble. "You're staying," he said one night, out of nowhere, halfway through a bowl of rice, not quite looking at either of them. "I mean, you keep saying it's just a few more days. But it's been a week and a half." Tsunade and Shizune exchanged a glance. "We're staying as long as it takes," Tsunade said carefully, "to make sure you're not doing everything in this village alone anymore." Naruto's chopsticks paused. He didn't say anything for a long moment, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were suspiciously bright, though he blinked hard and pretended otherwise, the way he'd clearly learned to pretend about a great many things. "Okay," he said, voice a little rough. "Okay. Good." It was, Shizune thought, one of the smallest words she had ever heard carry so much weight. Chapter 9. Iruka Yumino noticed the change before he understood the reason for it. It began with small things. Naruto's chakra exercises, which had for years been a source of visible, grinding frustration, suddenly showed a discipline that hadn't been there before, hands folding into seals with a precision that looked almost effortless. His written assignments came back with fewer careless errors, the sloppy, rushed handwriting of a boy who never had anyone check his homework replaced by something more deliberate, as if someone, somewhere, had finally sat with him and made him slow down. Iruka was not, by nature, a man who ignored things easily, whatever the reputation his early years of teaching had earned him. He had absorbed the village's quiet wariness toward Naruto the way most young shinobi absorbed it, without ever fully examining why, and it sat uneasily with him now, watching a boy visibly improve and realizing he could not take credit for a single part of it. He found the answer 3 days later, when he happened to walk past the training field on his way home and saw Tsunade of the Sannin, legendary medic and one of the 3 most famous shinobi the village had ever produced, crouched beside Naruto with her hand wrapped around his in the middle of adjusting a hand seal. Patient in a way Iruka had genuinely never expected to see from a woman whose reputation for short temper preceded her by a significant margin. He stopped at the fence, unnoticed by either of them, and watched for a long while. Again, Tsunade was saying, "Slower this time. You're rushing because you're used to nobody having the patience to wait for you to get it right. I have all the patience in the world. Use it." Naruto, red-faced with effort and concentration, nodded and tried again, slower, and this time the chakra that gathered at his palms held steady instead of scattering, a small but visible victory that made him whoop with delight loud enough that a startled bird took off from a nearby tree. "There," Tsunade said, something that might have been pride flickering across her face before she smoothed it back into her usual gruffness. "That's what it's supposed to look like. Don't let me catch you rushing again." Iruka walked the rest of the way home turning the scene over in his mind, and turning, alongside it, an uncomfortable question he had never let himself examine too closely before: how much of Naruto's academy struggle had actually been about ability, and how much had simply been the accumulated weight of an education delivered by people who had, without ever saying so out loud, decided he wasn't worth the same effort as everyone else. He resolved, that evening, to do better, and found, the next morning, that doing better was easier than he'd expected once he actually tried. He corrected Naruto's stance during kunai drills the same as he corrected everyone else's. He called on him during lessons, and was startled, more than once, by answers that were sharper and more considered than he'd have predicted from the boy's previous track record. "You've been practicing," Iruka said after class one day, and it wasn't quite a question. "Yeah." Naruto's grin was cautious, testing the water of a compliment he wasn't entirely sure was real. "Somebody's been helping me." "Actually helping, I mean, not just, not just being nice about it, and then not really doing anything. The comment landed harder than Naruto probably intended, and Iruka felt it land, a small, precise cut that told him exactly how the boy had experienced years of well-meaning inattention dressed up as tolerance. Well, Iruka said, and meant it more than he expected to when the words came out of him, keep it up. You're getting good. Naruto's whole face lit up, unguarded and bright in a way that made Iruka's chest ache faintly, and it occurred to him, walking home that evening, that it had taken two strangers passing through the village on unrelated business to notice something the entire village, himself included, had somehow managed not to see for 8 years. He thought about it for a long time that night, turning the discomfort over the way he might turn over a wound to check whether it had actually healed or only scarred over on the surface. He had told himself, for years, that his distance from Naruto was professional restraint, the appropriate neutrality of an instructor who could not afford to play favorites among 30 students competing for the same limited attention. Watching Tsunade correct the boy's hand seal with that same slow, deliberate patience she'd have given a fellow Sannin, he understood how thin that excuse actually was. He had not been withholding favoritism. He had been withholding the baseline decency he extended to every other child in the room without a second thought, and calling the withholding something more principled than it was. The next morning he arrived at the academy early, before the other students, and pulled Naruto's file from the record cabinet, reading through years of terse, minimal notation with a critical eye he had never turned on it before. Adequate. Needs improvement. No further comment. Each entry was true enough on its own and taken together, told a story less about the boy's ability than about a long chain of adults who had each decided, independently and without ever comparing notes, that he did not merit more than the minimum required accounting. Iruka closed the file, set it aside, and resolved that whatever the next entry read, it would at least be honest about the effort behind it. Chapter 10. The incident that changed how a handful of villagers looked at Naruto happened on an unremarkable afternoon, at a construction site near the market district where a scaffold, poorly secured, gave way with a groan of splintering wood and sent a young carpenter's apprentice tumbling toward the ground from a height that would have broken bones on impact, and possibly worse. Naruto was crossing the street on an errand for Shizune, a list of herbs in his pocket, when he heard the crack of splitting wood and looked up in time to see the boy, older than him by a few years, someone he vaguely recognized from around the neighborhood, falling. He didn't think. He moved. It wasn't a technique so much as pure instinct fused with the weeks of chakra control drilling Tsunade had hammered into him, a burst of chakra to his legs that closed the distance faster than should have been possible, arms out, catching most of the falling weight, and absorbing the rest by rolling with the impact the way Tsunade had shown him during a training session he hadn't realized, until this exact moment, was preparing him for anything real. They hit the ground hard, both of them, and for a terrible second Naruto thought he'd failed, that the boy was hurt regardless, until the apprentice groaned, sat up, and stared at Naruto with wide, stunned eyes. You caught me," the older boy said, disbelieving. "How did you?" A crowd had gathered by then, drawn by the noise of the collapsing scaffold, and Naruto became abruptly, uncomfortably aware of a dozen eyes on him, the familiar tightening in his chest that usually meant it was time to make himself smaller, to deflect, to disappear before the attention curdled into something worse. He braced for it out of habit. It didn't come. Instead, an older woman near the front of the crowd, someone Naruto didn't recognize, said quite loudly, "That's remarkable. He can't be more than 8. He's fast," someone else murmured. "Really fast. Did you see that?" The apprentice's mother arrived moments later, pushing through the crowd in a panic that dissolved into tears of relief when she found her son sitting up, unhurt, and when she understood what had happened, she turned to Naruto with an expression he had almost no experience interpreting, unguarded, uncomplicated gratitude, directed entirely at him. "Thank you," she said, gripping his hands in both of hers, hard enough that it startled him. Thank you. I don't know how to. What's your name?" "I want to make sure people know what you did." "Naruto," he said quietly, still braced for the moment this would go wrong, for someone in the crowd to remember who he was and let that memory sour the moment. It didn't happen, not that day. Word spread through the market district by evening the way word always did, embellished slightly with each retelling, and by the time Tsunade and Shizune heard about it, Second-hand, from Tucci at the ramen stand, the story had already acquired a small but real momentum. The Uzumaki boy, the one nobody paid much attention to, had saved a life with reflexes and control that shouldn't have belonged to someone his age. You could have told us, Tsunade said that evening, only half scolding, examining him for injuries he insisted he didn't have. It wasn't a big deal, Naruto said, and then, quieter, something more honest slipping through the deflection. I mean, it felt like a big deal. Nobody's ever looked at me like that before. Like I did something good instead of just existing somewhere they wished I wasn't. Shizune's hand found his shoulder, steady and warm, and Tsunade found herself, not for the first time in recent weeks, fighting the urge to march back to Hiruzen's office and demand an accounting of every single day the village had failed to notice this boy for exactly who he was. You did do something good, she said instead, firmly. And it's not going to be the last time people notice. Get used to it. It was not, in fact, the last time. But it was the first, and Naruto, falling asleep that night with the strange, unfamiliar warmth of being seen still sitting in his chest, understood, without quite having words for it yet, that something in his life had genuinely begun to change. The shift, when it came, was smaller and slower than any of them expected, and smaller than Naruto, in his private hope, had wanted it to be. The village did not turn overnight into a place that welcomed him. Some of the same shopkeepers who had watched the scaffold rescue unfold still tensed, faintly, when he passed their stalls the next week, old habit outlasting a single afternoon's evidence to the contrary. But a few did not. The carpenter's apprentice's mother stopped him on the street 2 days later to press a small paper-wrapped sweet into his hand, refusing to let him decline it, and an elderly man who ran a stationery shop began greeting him by name each morning, a small thing that Naruto nonetheless carried around with him for the rest of the day like a coin he kept checking was still in his pocket. Tsunade watched these small recalibrations with a clinical, careful attention, cataloging them the way she might catalog symptoms of a slow recovery, encouraged by the trend and unwilling to call it a cure. One good afternoon doesn't undo 8 years, she told Shizune quietly, out of Naruto's hearing, but it's a start. And starts are worth protecting. You sound like you're planning something, Shizune said. I'm always planning something, Tsunade said. In this case, mostly, I'm planning to make sure nobody in this village gets the chance to forget what he did, or who he is, ever again. Chapter 11. Danzo Shimura received the report the way he received most reports, without visible reaction, seated in the dim, spare quarters that served as both his office and, in practice, the nerve center of an organization that officially no longer existed. Tsunade of the Sannin has remained in the village for 2.5 weeks, the operative said, kneeling with his masked face angled respectfully toward the floor. Officially for an unresolved debt. Unofficially, she and her apprentice Shizune have taken a direct interest in the Uzumaki boy. Daily training sessions. Regular meals. There are indications the arrangement may become permanent. Danzo's single visible eye did not so much as flicker, though internally he turned the information over with the careful attention he gave to any development involving the Jinchuriki. He had watched the boy for years from a distance, patient, waiting for the moment circumstances would deliver him into a position where the Nine-Tails vessel could be properly cultivated, trained by hands that understood the true stakes of what the boy carried rather than left to grow up, as he largely had, in a vacuum of village indifference that Danzo privately considered both wasteful and, in its own way, dangerous. An unshaped weapon left unshaped. Tsunade's involvement complicated matters. She was, whatever her personal grievances with the village, a Sannin, a legend, and not a woman who could be quietly redirected or dismissed the way Danzo redirected and dismissed lesser obstacles. If she took the boy under her wing in earnest, the vessel he had been patiently waiting to claim for Root's purposes would grow up shaped by her hand rather than his, and Tsunade's hand, whatever its skill, was not one he could guide. Continue observation, he said finally. No direct contact. I want to know the shape of what's happening before I decide whether it requires correction. Understood. The operative withdrew, and Danzo sat alone with the information for a long while, weighing possibilities with the same cold patience that had served him through decades of quiet, largely unseen influence over the village's affairs. Tsunade's presence was not, on its own, cause for alarm. Sannin came and went. Tempers cooled. Debts got collected and travelers moved on to wherever travelers moved on to. But there was something in the pattern of the reports that gave him pause, not the training, which was unremarkable in itself, but the boy's improvement, faster and more marked than raw natural talent alone could easily explain. If Tsunade had noticed something about the child's chakra, something related to the seal, something that might complicate the delicate arrangement Danzo had spent years quietly maintaining with Hiruzen's tacit, uneasy tolerance, then her extended presence in the village became a great deal more significant than a passing act of charity. He would wait. He was, above all things, a patient man, and patience had served him well in matters far more delicate than one orphaned boy and two wandering Sannin who might, in the end, simply grow bored and move on the way they always had before. But he would watch closely, and he would not, under any circumstances, allow himself to be caught unprepared if the arrangement proved to be something more permanent than either woman currently understood it to be. Send word, he added, as the operative reached the door, that I wish to be informed the moment either of them makes any move toward formalizing guardianship through official channels. That, and only that, would require my direct attention. The operative bowed and was gone, and Danzo returned to the stack of reports on his desk, unhurried, unbothered, a man for whom patience had always, eventually, paid its dividends. Chapter 12. 3 weeks became a month, and a month became something neither Tsunade nor Shizune bothered pretending was temporary anymore. The inn-room had long since given way to Naruto's apartment, which had, in that time, transformed from a bare, sparsely furnished space into something that actually resembled a home. Real food in the cupboards, a second futon rolled up in the corner for Shizune, a training log tacked to the wall in Tsunade's sharp, impatient handwriting tracking Naruto's progress week over week. It was Shizune who finally said the word neither of them had used aloud, on a quiet evening while Naruto was asleep in the next room, worn out from a training session that had pushed him harder than usual. We should make it official, she said. Guardianship. Not just, living here. Actually official, through the village registry, so no landlord can raise his rent on a whim, and no clerk can pretend he doesn't have anyone looking out for him. Tsunade was quiet for a long moment, turning a cup of tea between her hands, and Shizune recognized the particular stillness that meant she was doing the things she rarely allowed herself, actually feeling something all the way through instead of burying it under irritation or distraction. I told myself I wasn't doing this again, Tsunade said finally, quiet. Getting attached. Every time I have, it's ended in a grave I still can't visit. Nawaki. Dan. I promised myself, a long time ago, that I was done handing my heart to people the world seemed determined to take from me. I know. Shizune reached over, covered Tsunade's hand with her own. But he's not them. And you're not the same person who made that promise, not anymore. Not after watching that boy light up over a bowl of rice like it was the greatest thing that had ever happened to him. You already made the choice, Tsunade. Weeks ago. This is just paperwork catching up to something your heart already decided. Tsunade laughed, short and rough, not quite steady. When did you get so wise? I learned from watching you make every mistake first, Shizune said, with the small, fond smile she reserved only for moments like this one. Somebody had to learn something from it. They went to Hiruzen the next morning, and the old Hokage listened to their request with an expression that shifted, over the course of the conversation, from careful neutrality to something Tsunade hadn't seen on his face in years, unguarded relief, the particular exhale of a man who has carried a guilt for a very long time and has just been handed, unexpectedly, a way to set part of it down. I will need to process it through the proper channels, he said, but I see no obstacle, and considerable reason to expedite it. Frankly, Tsunade, I cannot think of anyone in this village I would rather see raising that boy. Careful, Tsunade said. That almost sounded like a compliment. It was entirely a compliment, Hiruzen said, and there was warmth in it, real and unmistakable, the first genuinely happy thing Tsunade had felt in that office in longer than she cared to calculate. They told Naruto that evening, over dinner, and watched the news land on him in slow motion, confusion first, then disbelief, Then something that broke open across his face so completely that for a moment neither woman was certain whether he was about to laugh or cry, and it turned out, in the end, to be both. I get to actually have a family, he said, voice cracking on the word, and Tsunade, who had spent decades building walls specifically designed to keep this exact kind of vulnerability at arm's length, found herself pulling him into a hug before she'd consciously decided to do it, Shizune's arms coming around them both a moment later. You already had one, Tsunade said, rough. We're just making it official. Later that night, long after Naruto had finally fallen asleep, worn out from an evening of happiness so unfamiliar it had apparently exhausted him as much as any training session, Tsunade stood at the window of the apartment that was now, undeniably, hers as much as his, looking out over a village that had spent 8 years failing this boy without ever quite admitting it was doing so. She did not see the figure watching from a rooftop 2 streets over, patient, unmoving, cataloging the lit window and the shape of a family that had not existed a month before and now, apparently did. Danzo Shimura had waited a long time for many things. He could wait a little longer for this one too, watching the arrangement solidify into something official, something harder to unravel, and beginning, with the same careful patience that had guided every other calculation of his long career, to consider what correction, if any, such permanence might eventually require. For now, he only watched, and made a single notation in the private ledger he kept on matters too sensitive for any official record: guardianship pending, subjects Senju Tsunade and Kato Shizune, disposition unclear, further observation warranted. It was a small entry, a single line among hundreds, and gave no indication, to anyone who might have glimpsed it, of how carefully he intended to track everything that grew from it in the months to come. Inside the apartment, none of that mattered yet. Naruto slept soundly for the first time in longer than either woman had known him, curled on his side with one hand still loosely closed around the sleeve of Tsunade's coat, as though some part of him, even unconscious, wanted proof that she would still be there in the morning. Shizune banked the last of the evening's dishes and paused in the doorway to watch them both, the fierce, unlikely family that had assembled itself out of a debt collection gone sideways and a boy too stubborn to stay invisible. We're really doing this, she said softly. We already did it, Tsunade said, not looking away from the sleeping boy. Everything else is just catching up. Outside, the village settled into its ordinary nightly quiet, unaware that the shape of one small, overlooked life within its walls had just changed for good, and that the changes still coming, gathering somewhere beyond the reach of any window's light, would ask more of all 3 of them than any of them yet understood. Act 2. Chapter 1. 3 years changed more about Naruto Uzumaki than he could have charted on any single map, though if pressed, he would have said the biggest difference wasn't the training, or the taller frame he was slowly growing into, or even the steadily improving marks that had once seemed like something other kids got to have. It was that he no longer woke up and had to remember, in the first groggy seconds of morning, that no one was coming. Now someone was always there. Usually it was Shizune, moving quietly through the kitchen with the particular economy of someone who had learned exactly how he liked his tea and never needed to ask twice. Some mornings it was Tsunade, bleary from a late card game and grumbling about it, though she never once, in 3 years, failed to show up for their 6 o'clock training session regardless of how little sleep she'd gotten arguing with Dice the night before. The apartment had grown with them. A second bedroom, cobbled together from what had once been storage space, belonged to Shizune now in every sense but the deed, and Tonton had a dedicated corner with a cushion that Naruto had personally sewn, badly, the stitches uneven but sincere, a gift he'd insisted on making with his own hands rather than buying something nicer from the market. The kitchen smelled, more mornings than not, like something other than instant ramen, though Naruto still maintained, loudly and often, that ramen remained the single greatest food ever invented by any civilization in recorded history. He was 11 now, tall for his age in the gawky, unfinished way of boys who hadn't yet grown into their own limbs, and the whisker marks on his cheeks, which had once made strangers flinch, had become simply a part of a face people in his immediate circle had stopped seeing as anything other than his. Not everyone in the village had caught up to that shift. There were still shopkeepers who watched him a beat too long when he entered, still parents who steered their children a half-step wider around him on the street. Old fear that 3 years of small, accumulating evidence hadn't fully dislodged. But the balance had tipped, gradually and unevenly, in a direction that mattered. The ramen stand, where he was still Tsuchi's favorite customer, had been joined by a handful of others, a dango shop 2 streets over where the owner slipped him an extra skewer more often than not, a training ground caretaker who'd started greeting him by name, a scattering of ordinary kindnesses that had, brick by brick, built something that had never existed for him before. A reputation that wasn't entirely built on fear. His training had grown alongside him. Tsunade no longer needed to correct his basic chakra control, which had become, by the standards of anyone his age, exceptional, a testament to 3 years of drilling and the particular stubbornness that had once been his only real weapon and had since become an actual asset. She had begun, in the last year, introducing him to the fundamentals of medical ninjutsu, not because she expected him to become a medic, his temperament ran too hot and too restless for that particular discipline, but because she believed, with the conviction of someone who had watched too many shinobi die of wounds a little more knowledge might have saved, that every ninja should understand enough of the body to know what they were risking every time they threw a punch or took one. You don't have to master it, she told him, more than once, watching him struggle through the delicate chakra threading of a basic diagnostic technique. You just have to understand it well enough to know when something's wrong. That knowledge has saved my life more times than any jutsu ever has. Shizune, for her part, had taken on the role of teaching him the things that fell outside Tsunade's more combat-focused instruction: reconnaissance, subtlety, the patient, careful work of reading a room or a person before acting. She had also, somewhere in the last 3 years, become something Naruto had no adequate word for beyond family, an older sister in every way that mattered, the person he went to first when a problem felt too complicated for Tsunade's blunter approach to solve cleanly. It was, by any honest measure, a good life, built out of the wreckage of a lonelier one, and Naruto understood, even at 11, how rare and fragile that kind of rebuilding actually was. What he did not yet understand, walking to the academy on a bright autumn morning 3 years after 2 travelers had nearly walked past him entirely, was how closely certain eyes in the village had continued watching the family he'd found, waiting patiently for the moment it might, in someone else's estimation, need correcting. Chapter 2. The chakra scalpel was, by Shizune's own admission, one of the harder techniques to teach a student whose natural inclination was force rather than finesse, and she had approached the lesson with a patience that had, over 3 years, become something close to a signature between them. It's not about pushing more chakra into your hand, she said, for what might have been the 40th time that month, watching Naruto's attempt fizzle out into an unfocused shimmer instead of the fine, precise edge the technique required. It's about pushing less, and controlling it more tightly. You keep trying to solve this like a strength problem. It's a precision problem. I know. Naruto shook out his hand, frustration written plainly across his face, though it was, Shizune noted, a different flavor of frustration than the one she remembered from years earlier, no longer laced with the fear that failure meant abandonment, just the ordinary, healthy frustration of a kid who wanted to be better at something and hadn't gotten there yet. It's just, Bachan makes it look so easy. Bachan, Tsunade said dryly, from where she was seated nearby reviewing medical texts, has been doing this for over 40 years. You've been doing it for 6 months. Some perspective would serve you well, brat. I'm just saying, maybe I should stick to stuff that's more, me. Loud stuff. Stuff that hits things. You'll do the loud stuff too, Tsunade said, not looking up from her book. This isn't instead of that. It's in addition to it. The best shinobi I've ever known were the ones who could do more than one thing well. Predictable is easy to kill. Versatile is not. Naruto huffed, but he tried again, and this time, whether through stubbornness or genuine improvement, the chakra at his fingertips sharpened into something closer to what the technique demanded, thin and precise instead of the wild, overflowing bursts that had characterized his earliest years of training. There, Shizune said, quiet satisfaction in her voice. That's it. Hold that feeling. Memorize what your hand is doing right now, because that's the difference between this working and this not working. He held it for nearly 3 full seconds before it collapsed, but 3 seconds, Shizune knew, was an eternity compared to where he'd started, and she watched his face light up with the particular pride of someone who had earned a victory rather than been handed one. It was these small moments, accumulating steadily over years, that had taught Shizune something about raising a child that she suspected few people got to learn secondhand, that the difference between a kid who thrived and one who didn't was rarely about raw talent, and almost always about whether someone stood close enough, long enough, to notice the 3 seconds of progress buried inside an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. Take a break, Tsunade said, setting her book aside and studying Naruto with the assessing eye she still brought to every training session, 3 years in and no less thorough than the first day. You've been at this for 2 hours. Even chakra needs rest, and so does concentration. Naruto flopped down onto the grass, breathing hard, and Tonton, who had been dozing nearby, ambled over to flop down beside him with a contented grunt, prompting a tired laugh out of him that Shizune found, even after 3 years, disproportionately gratifying to hear. Can I ask you guys something? He said, after a moment, staring up at the sky. Do you ever miss, like, actually traveling? Gambling in weird towns, doing your own thing? I know you say you don't regret staying, but I dunno. Sometimes I wonder if I'm holding you back from something. Tsunade and Shizune exchanged a glance over his head, the kind of wordless communication 3 years of shared parenting had made effortless between them. Naruto, Tsunade said, settling down onto the grass beside him without an ounce of her usual dignity. I have gambled in more towns than I can remember the names of, and every single one of them is exactly as replaceable as the last. You are not. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked up at the sky with an expression that was working hard not to show how much that had landed, and Shizune, watching, thought that some conversations mattered more than any training technique they could have spent the afternoon on instead. Chapter 3. The Academy's final year sorted students, whether anyone admitted it out loud or not, into a rough hierarchy of talent, and Sasuke Uchiha sat, without contest, at the top of it, the last son of a decimated clan carrying a weight of expectation that would have crushed most children and had instead, in him, hardened into a controlled, distant sort of intensity that kept nearly everyone at arm's length. Naruto had spent years, before Tsunade and Shizune, wanting Sasuke's attention the way a person wants sunlight, indiscriminately and out of a kind of desperate hope that any recognition might do. That hunger had faded, not entirely, but enough that when Sasuke finally looked at him with something other than mild, dismissive indifference, it landed differently than it would have 3 years earlier. It happened during a sparring exercise, pairs rotating through a series of drills under Iruka's supervision, and Naruto found himself matched against Sasuke for the first time in longer than he could remember, an accident of the rotation rather than anything intentional. Don't hold back, Sasuke said, settling into a stance, the closest thing to a greeting he tended to offer anyone. Wasn't planning to, Naruto said, and meant it, and the match that followed was closer than either of them expected, close enough that a few classmates paused their own drills to watch, close enough that Sasuke, for the first time in Naruto's memory, looked genuinely surprised partway through, his usual composure cracking just slightly at the edges. It ended in a draw, both of them breathing hard, Iruka calling it before either could press an advantage that might have turned careless. Sasuke straightened, studying Naruto with an expression that had shifted from indifference into something more careful, more assessing. You've gotten stronger, he said, and it wasn't quite a compliment, delivered in the flat, guarded tone he used for most things, but it wasn't nothing either. Yeah, well. Naruto grinned, wiping sweat from his forehead. I've had good teachers. He didn't elaborate, and Sasuke didn't ask, and the two of them fell into step walking back toward the academy building with the easy, wordless truce of two people who had just discovered a mutual respect either had expected to find. It was Sakura Haruno who noticed the shift most keenly, watching from the sidelines with the sharp attentiveness of someone who tracked social currents the way other students tracked chakra theory. She had spent years dismissing Naruto as loud and unserious, an assessment built less on careful observation than on the general village consensus she'd absorbed without questioning, the way children absorbed most of their early opinions about the world around them. He's actually pretty good now, she said to her friend Ino during the walk home, unable to fully keep the surprise out of her voice. Everyone says his new guardians are, like actual legends, Ino said. My mom says Tsunade of the Sannin basically adopted him. Can you imagine having her teach you? Sakura filed that information away with more interest than she'd have admitted, and found herself, over the following weeks, watching Naruto with something closer to genuine attention than the reflexive dismissal she'd carried for years, an early crack in an opinion that had never actually been examined closely before now. It surprised her, once she started paying real attention, how much of her earlier judgment had been borrowed rather than earned. She could not, when she tried honestly to trace it back, remember a single specific incident that had convinced her Naruto was someone to dismiss. It had simply been the ambient opinion of the world she'd grown up in, absorbed the way children absorb which foods their family considers acceptable, or which neighborhoods are spoken of with a particular wariness, without ever once being asked to justify the belief on its own merits. Watching him now, methodical and focused during drills, answering questions in class with an accuracy that had clearly cost him real effort to build, she found the old dismissal harder to sustain with each passing week, and harder still to explain to Ino, who remained more invested in cataloging Sasuke's every gesture than in reconsidering anyone else's reputation. Not every shift, that autumn, was so gentle. There remained a handful of classmates, mostly the children of civilian council members who had absorbed their parents' unease more thoroughly than most, who continued treating Naruto with a wariness that no amount of improved sparring scores seemed able to fully dissolve. Naruto had learned, over 3 years, not to let that wariness cut as deep as it once had, though it still stung in the quiet moments, a reminder that acceptance, once lost this broadly, rebuilt itself slowly and unevenly, one relationship at a time, rather than all at once in a single grand reversal. He mentioned as much to Shizune that evening, working through the day's frustrations the way he'd learned to over the years, out loud, to someone who would actually listen. Some of them still look at me like I'm gonna do something wrong, he said. Even after everything. Some people take longer to update what they believe than others, Shizune said gently. That's not a flaw in you, Naruto. It's a flaw in how slowly some fears let go, even once the evidence stops supporting them. You don't have to fix that for them. You just have to keep being exactly who you are, and let the ones worth keeping catch up in their own time. He nodded, and didn't fully believe her, not yet, but he filed the words away the way he filed away most things she told him, carefully, for a day when he might need them more. Chapter 4. The civilian council did not, technically, have authority over a Hokage's private decisions regarding a ward of the village, a fact that had not stopped a small faction of its more vocal members from attempting to exercise influence over the matter regardless. It sets an uncomfortable precedent, Councilman Hama said, at a session Hiruzen had allowed mostly out of a weary sense of obligation rather than any expectation the discussion would produce something useful. A Sannin of Tsunade's stature, effectively raising a child with his particular circumstances, largely outside any oversight beyond her own judgment. What happens to the village's ability to manage the situation if her judgment and the village's needs diverge? The situation, Hiruzen repeated, with a mildness that did not fully mask the edge underneath it, is an 11-year-old boy who is, by every available account, thriving under care he did not have access to for the first 8 years of his life. I am struggling, Councilman, to locate the crisis in that outcome. With respect, Hokage-sama, the concern isn't the boy's well-being. It's the concentration of influence. Tsunade of the Sannin is a formidable figure in her own right. If she raises the vessel to see his loyalties as running through her rather than through the village. Choose your next words carefully, Hiruzen said, and something in his voice, quiet as it remained, made the room still in a way that Hama's louder objections never had. You are speaking about a child, in a room where several people present are aware of exactly what that child carries and exactly how much discretion that awareness demands. I would remind you that the law protecting his circumstances applies equally to the manner in which you discuss him. Hama subsided, chastened, though the concern he'd voiced did not fully leave the room with his silence. It found its way, as most concerns eventually did in a village with more informants than any single council could account for, to Danzo, who received the report of the meeting with the same unhurried attention he gave everything, turning the civilian council's unease over like a tool he hadn't yet decided how to use. He had been patient for 3 years. Patience, in his long experience, was rarely wasted, and the situation, as it stood, had not yet crossed into territory requiring more direct intervention. Tsunade's training had, if anything, produced results Danzo found himself grudgingly approving of: a Jinchuriki with vastly improved control, discipline, and combat capability, assets that would serve the village well regardless of whose hand had cultivated them. What concerned him, watching from his careful distance, was not the training. It was the loyalty. A weapon shaped by devotion to two individuals rather than to the village as an abstract, institutional whole was a weapon whose reliability, in a crisis requiring sacrifice the boy might not willingly make for two people he loved rather than an institution he merely served, could not be fully guaranteed. He raised the matter with Hiruzen directly, some days later, in the careful, circling manner that characterized most of his conversations with the Hokage. Two old comrades who had long since stopped fully trusting one another's judgment, while never quite abandoning the pretense of shared purpose. The boy grows stronger, Danzo said. That much is undeniable, and to your credit. But strength without the correct loyalties is a blade with no guaranteed direction. Have you considered where his devotion will lie, when the village someday requires something of him that Tsunade herself would not choose to give? I have considered it a great deal, Hiruzen said. And I have concluded that a boy who loves the people around him, and who has been taught by those people to understand what he protects and why, will make better choices in a crisis than one raised to see himself as an instrument with no attachments to weigh against an order. You and I have disagreed about this principle for decades, Danzo. I do not expect either of us to change our minds about it now. No, Danzo agreed, something unreadable moving behind his single visible eye. I do not suppose we will. I only hope, old friend, that your faith and attachment proves sturdier than mine has ever found it to be, when the moment eventually arrives to test it. He left the tower without waiting for a response, and Hiruzen sat alone afterward for a long while, turning the conversation over with the particular unease of a man who suspected, however much he hoped otherwise, that Danzo's warnings had a way of becoming self-fulfilling more often than either of them would have liked. He thought, in the quiet that followed, of all the ways he had tried to protect Naruto over the years within the narrow bounds his position allowed, and all the ways those efforts had fallen short until two strangers, entirely outside his own careful calculations, had simply walked into the village and decided, on instinct and conscience rather than any political strategy, to do what an institution had failed to manage in 8 years. There was a lesson in that, he suspected, about the limits of governing from a position of caution rather than one of genuine conviction, though it was a lesson he doubted Danzo, for all his intelligence, would ever be capable of learning. Chapter 5. The question, when it finally came, arrived on an unremarkable evening, over a dinner that had grown, in 3 years, into a genuinely comfortable ritual. The three of them and Tonton crowded around a table too small for the amount of food Tsunade insisted on cooking whenever it was her turn. Can I ask you something? Naruto said, pushing rice around his bowl with more focus than the action required, and you don't have to answer if it's, like, a secret thing. But do you know anything about my parents? Like, actually no, not just village gossip. The table went quiet in a way that told him, before either woman said a word, that the answer was more complicated than a simple yes or no. Tsunade set down her chopsticks, and Shizune's eyes flicked toward her, the careful, wordless check of someone deferring to another's judgment on a matter too sensitive to navigate alone. There are things about your parents that are protected under a law even I can't override, Tsunade said finally, choosing each word with more care than she usually bothered with. Not because anyone thinks you don't deserve to know. Because the knowledge, if it got out to the wrong ears before you were ready to carry it, could put you in real danger. That's not me keeping secrets from you to protect myself, Naruto. It's the third Hokage protecting you, in the one way he's actually been consistent about for your entire life. Naruto absorbed this with the particular quiet he'd developed over the years for information that mattered more than it initially seemed to, turning it over before responding rather than reacting on impulse the way he once might have. Did you know them? He asked. Before. Is that why you? I didn't know your parents personally, no, Tsunade said. But I want you to hear this clearly, because I mean every word of it. Whatever you eventually learn about where you come from, it will not change how Shizune and I feel about you, not even slightly. We didn't choose you because of your parents. We chose you because of who you are, which we watched, with our own eyes over years, brat by brat, choice by choice. I know that, Naruto said, quiet, and mostly meant it, though something in his chest still ached at the edges of the unanswered question, an old wound that 3 years of family had softened without fully closing. There is one thing I can tell you, Shizune offered, gently, glancing at Tsunade for permission before continuing, and receiving a small, tired nod. Your name. Uzumaki. It belonged to a clan that was known, before it was mostly lost, for extraordinary vitality and chakra reserves, and for a particular, stubborn kind of strength that didn't back down from anything. Whatever else you don't know yet, you can know that. It's in your blood, and it was there long before either of us met you. Naruto turned that information over carefully, something in his posture straightening almost imperceptibly, the particular pride of a person handed a small, real piece of a puzzle he'd been missing his whole life. A whole clan, he said. Is there anyone else? Anywhere? Not that we know of, Tsunade said, and there was real gentleness in it, the kind she reserved almost exclusively for him. I'm sorry, Naruto. I wish I had a better answer. He nodded, quiet for a while, and then, in the resilient way that had characterized him for as long as either woman had known him, found his way back towards something lighter, some deliberate act of will that both of them recognized by now as entirely his own, a boy choosing, again and again, not to let grief have the whole of him. Well, he said, managing something close to his usual grin, guess I've got a lot to live up to then. Gonna be the strongest Uzumaki there ever was. No pressure or anything. None at all, Tsunade said dryly, though her eyes were suspiciously bright, and under the table, without either of them fully deciding to, her hand found his shoulder and stayed there for the rest of the meal. Chapter 6. Iruka Umino had, over the 3 years since a chance encounter with Tsunade at a training field fence, had rearranged his sense of what he owed his students, become something closer to an advocate for Naruto than a mere instructor, a shift that had not gone unnoticed by either the boy or the 2 women who had, in effect, adopted them both into a loose, unconventional extended family. You're leading the graduating class this year, Naruto said one afternoon, catching Iruka after the other students had filed out, which means you're the one who decides if I pass, right? That's roughly how it works, yes? Iruka began gathering the day's scrolls, an old habit of tidiness that had outlasted every other change in his teaching style. Why, worried? Nah. Naruto grinned, and there was a confidence in it now that had nothing performative about it, earned rather than assembled out of necessity the way his earliest grins had been. Just want to make sure you're paying attention when I nail the graduation exam. Gonna be the best in the class. Confident, Iruka said, amused despite himself. Sasuke might have something to say about that ranking. Sasuke can fight me for it, Naruto said, cheerful and entirely serious at once, and Iruka found himself, not for the first time, marveling at how far the boy in front of him had traveled from the anxious, deflecting child who used to leave the academy through the side gate to avoid the parents waiting out front. The final year of academy training moved at a pace that felt, to most students, like a slow tightening of expectation, lessons growing denser, drills growing more demanding, the looming graduation exam a horizon everyone could feel approaching whether they were ready for it or not. Naruto approached it with the same fierce, methodical determination Tsunade had spent 3 years cultivating in him, treating every difficulty as a technical problem rather than a referendum on his worth, a shift so complete that Iruka sometimes forgot, watching him work through a particularly stubborn exercise, that this was the same boy who had once thrown himself at problems with more heart than strategy, and little to show for the difference. There remained one persistent obstacle, the standard clone technique, a staple of the graduation exam, which required a fine, controlled release of a small, precise amount of chakra to form a stable illusory duplicate. For most students this was straightforward. For Naruto, whose reserves dwarfed those of every other student in his class by a margin that still occasionally startled even Tsunade, the technique fought against his very nature, chakra flooding out in a wild overabundance that the clone technique's delicate mechanics simply couldn't process cleanly. It's the one thing I can't get right, he admitted to Shizune one evening, frustration audible even through his usual determination to treat every setback as temporary. I've got the control down for basically everything else. But this one just won't work, no matter how hard I try to dial it back. Then maybe the answer isn't dialing it back, Shizune said thoughtfully, turning the problem over with the same careful attention she brought to any puzzle involving him. Have you asked Tsunade about substitution clauses in the exam requirements? Some academies allow an equivalent technique if a student can demonstrate genuine mastery of an alternative that fulfills the same practical purpose. It was Tsunade, 2 days later, who suggested the shadow clone technique, an advanced variant that used exactly the kind of overwhelming chakra reserves that made the standard clones so difficult for him, transforming his greatest apparent weakness into what would become, though none of them fully understood it yet, one of his greatest eventual strengths. It's technically above your grade level, she said, watching him form his first solid, physically real clone with something like disbelief on his face. But if the exam allows equivalent techniques, and I intend to make very sure it does, there's no reason you should have to force yourself into a shape that was never built for you in the first place. Naruto stared at his own clone, an exact, solid duplicate of himself standing a few feet away, and broke into a grin so wide it looked like it might genuinely hurt. This is so much cooler than the normal one, he said, and Tsunade, watching him marvel at a technique she'd handed him specifically because the standard path had refused to fit him, thought that there was a lesson buried in that moment worth remembering long after the graduation exam had come and gone. They spent the rest of the afternoon refining it, Naruto producing clone after clone until he could summon a handful at once without visibly tiring, an endurance that startled even Tsunade, who had trained enough shinobi over the decades to know how quickly most of them burned through reserves attempting anything at this scale. His clones argued with each other over minor points of form, bickered about whose turn it was to demonstrate a stance, and generally behaved with enough independent personality that Shizune, arriving partway through to bring water, found herself laughing at the sight of 6 identical boys squabbling over a single canteen. You could use this for more than just the exam, Tsunade said thoughtfully, watching the clones dispel one by one in small puffs of smoke. Reconnaissance. Training multiple techniques simultaneously, if the theory about shared memory holds up the way I suspect it does. This isn't just a substitution for a technique you couldn't manage, Naruto. It's a genuine advantage most shinobi twice your age would trade a great deal to have. He turned that over with visible pride, the kind that had nothing boastful in it, just the quiet satisfaction of a boy realizing that what had once felt like a flaw, chakra reserves too large for his own control to properly contain, had become, in the right hands and with the right patience, something worth admiring instead of hiding. Chapter 7. The trouble started small, the way trouble involving children usually did, and might have stayed small if the boy at the center of it hadn't been the son of a councilman who had never fully let go of the unease Hama and his faction had been nursing for years. His name was Daisuke, and he had absorbed, from dinner-table conversations he was too young to fully understand the weight of, a conviction that Naruto's presence in the academy represented something the adults around him found troubling, a conviction he expressed with the blunt, unfiltered cruelty children reserve for ideas they've inherited rather than examined. My dad says you shouldn't even be allowed in the same building as the rest of us, Daisuke said, cornering Naruto near the equipment shed during a break between drills, flanked by 2 friends who seemed less committed to the confrontation than simply unwilling to be the one who backed out first. Says it's not natural, whatever's wrong with you. Says the only reason you're passing anything is because some Sanin's covering for you. I'm passing because I work harder than you do, Naruto said, and there was an edge in it, old hurt surfacing faster than 3 years of healing had fully smoothed away, but there was also, notably, restraint, the particular discipline of someone who had learned, through long practice, not to let provocation dictate his choices. Move. I've got drills. Or what? Daisuke pushed, literal and immediate, a shove to the chest that Naruto absorbed without stumbling, years of physical training making the gesture look almost comically ineffective. Gonna go cry to your fake grandma? It was the word fake that did it. Less because of any sting to Naruto's own feelings and more because of what it implied about Tsunade and Shizune, a dismissal of something that had cost all 3 of them real effort to build, and Naruto's fist was halfway raised before a sharper, better-trained instinct caught it and held it there, unclenched, a full second of visible, deliberate restraint that several classmates would later describe, retelling the story, as the moment they actually understood how much control the loud, once dismissed boy had actually developed. "They're not fake," he said low and steady. "And I'm not gonna hit you, because that's exactly what you want, so you can go tell your dad I proved his point. But you're wrong. About all of it." He walked away, and the confrontation might have ended there, an ordinary, unremarkable schoolyard tension resolved without incident, if Daisuke hadn't, humiliated by the audience that had gathered, shoved him again from behind, harder, sending him stumbling into the equipment shed's wall with enough force to draw blood from a scraped elbow. Iruka arrived in time to see the aftermath rather than the act itself, and the report that reached Tsunade that evening, filtered through Naruto's characteristically minimizing account, still contained enough detail to set her jaw in a way Shizune recognized as dangerous. "I handled it," Naruto insisted, wincing as Shizune cleaned the scrape. "I didn't even hit him back. You should be proud of me, actually, that took way more effort than punching him would've." "I am proud of you," Tsunade said, and meant it entirely, "and I'm also going to have a conversation with that boy's father tomorrow morning that he is not going to enjoy." "Bachan, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Tsunade said. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference, and you should get used to people making that particular choice on your behalf, because I intend to keep making it for as long as anyone in this village thinks calling us fake is an acceptable thing to say to my son." The word landed in the room with more weight than either woman had planned for it to carry, an admission spoken plainly for the first time rather than lived quietly and left unnamed, and Naruto went very still, staring at Tsunade with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and a hope he'd apparently been too careful to let himself fully feel until she said it out loud. "Your son," he repeated quiet. "That's what I said." Tsunade's voice was rough, but she didn't look away from him. "Did I stutter?" "No," Naruto said, and something in his chest, some old, careful reserve he'd kept even through 3 good years, finally let go entirely. "No, you didn't." Chapter 8. Councilman Hama had not expected Tsunade of the Sannin to appear at his home before breakfast, and he expected even less the calm, deliberate fury with which she informed him, standing on his doorstep with her arms crossed and no interest whatsoever in coming inside, that his son had put hands on her ward and repeated rhetoric that could only have come from conversations Hama himself had clearly failed to keep private. "I raised the concern in a closed council session," Hama said, flustered, attempting a dignity he could not quite locate. "I never told my son to repeat it, let alone to act on it physically." "You raised a concern about whether my judgment could be trusted with a child's well-being," Tsunade said, "in a room your own son apparently has better access to than you'd like to admit, because somehow that concern found its way into his mouth specifically enough that he used the word fake to describe a family he has never once observed up close." "Children repeat what they hear, Councilman. If you don't like what came out of his mouth, I'd start by examining what's been going into his ears." She left before he could formulate a response, which suited her fine, since she hadn't come for a debate. She had come to be seen, and to make certain that word of the conversation would travel through the council with exactly the message she intended it to carry, that whatever quiet political reservations certain members continued to harbor about her guardianship, testing those reservations against her directly, or through their children, would cost them more than the exercise was worth. The matter reached the full council within the week regardless, Hama pressing a formal complaint about Tsunade's conduct at his home despite the circumstances that had provoked it, and Hiruzen found himself, not for the first time, mediating a dispute he privately felt no genuine ambivalence about at all. She threatened a sitting council member, Hama insisted, though even his own allies on the council looked less than fully convinced by the framing. "That is not acceptable conduct, regardless of the provocation. She informed you, calmly and without violence, of your son's behavior toward her ward, and its likely origins," Hiruzen said. "I have reviewed the account from multiple witnesses, Councilman, including your son's own classmates, and I find nothing in it resembling a threat. I find, instead, a mother advocating for her child, which I would remind this council is precisely the kind of behavior we should hope every guardian in this village exhibits, rather than one we treat as a disciplinary matter." The word mother, spoken plainly and without hesitation by the Hokage himself, settled the matter in the room more effectively than any procedural argument could have, several council members exchanging glances that suggested the political ground beneath Hama's complaint had just shifted considerably. I would also note, Hiruzen continued, that this council does not have jurisdiction over Tsunade's guardianship, which was formalized through the proper channels 3 years ago and remains, by every measure available to this office, an unambiguous success. I would strongly advise against pursuing further complaints on this matter unless they come with evidence considerably more substantial than a schoolyard argument that your own son instigated. Hama withdrew the complaint within the day, and the incident, though it lingered in council gossip for weeks afterward, produced an outcome none of its instigators had intended, a wider, more public confirmation, delivered from the Hokage's own mouth, of a bond the village's more suspicious corners had spent 3 years quietly hoping might prove temporary. Danzo received the full account, as he received most things eventually, and read it with the same unhurried attention he gave everything, noting, with a flicker of something that might have been reassessment, how thoroughly the political ground had shifted beneath any future attempt to challenge the arrangement through conventional means. He would need, he understood, a different sort of leverage entirely, should the moment ever come that leverage was required. He set the report aside, unbothered on the surface, and began, quietly and without any outward sign of the recalculation taking place, to consider what shape that leverage might eventually need to take. For now, the council incident faded into the ordinary churn of village gossip, remembered mostly as the day the Hokage himself had settled, once and for all, any lingering official doubt about the legitimacy of Tsunade's guardianship. Hama kept a wary distance from the matter afterward, and his son, Daisuke, found himself the subject of a rather different kind of scrutiny at home, his father's political embarrassment translating, in the way such things often did, into a stricter household and considerably less freedom to repeat opinions he had never been equipped to properly evaluate in the first place. Naruto, for his part, gave the whole affair little further thought once the immediate sting had faded, more interested in the graduation exam looming ahead of him than in a schoolyard conflict that had, in the end, resolved itself entirely in his favor without requiring him to lift a single further finger. Chapter 9. The morning of the graduation exam arrived with a clear sky and a nervous energy that seemed to hum through the entire academy. Students clustered in small groups reviewing notes, or pacing off excess adrenaline, the accumulated weight of years finally arriving at its single, decisive test. Naruto had woken before his alarm, a rarity for him, and found Tsunade already awake in the kitchen, 2 cups of tea steaming on the table as though she'd known, without being told, exactly when he'd come looking for the reassurance he wouldn't admit out loud he needed. "You're going to be fine," she said before he'd even sat down. "I've watched you train for 3 years. I've seen exactly what you're capable of, and today is just the first time the rest of this village gets to see it too. What if the substitution thing doesn't work? What if Iruka-sensei says the shadow clone doesn't count, and I fail because I still can't do the normal one? Then I will have a very pointed conversation with the examination board," Tsunade said dryly, "but it won't come to that. I made certain of the accommodation weeks ago. All you have to do today is exactly what you've already proven you can do 100 times over in that training field. Trust the work." He did trust it, mostly, though the nerves didn't fully leave him until he was standing in the examination room itself, watching classmates ahead of him in the alphabetical order file through their turns. Sasuke's precise, unhurried demonstration, drawing a small, approving nod from the examiners. Sakura's clean, competent performance, better than she'd have managed a year earlier, a fact Naruto noted with genuine, uncomplicated happiness for her rather than the old, reflexive envy he might once have felt. When his name was called, he stepped forward, and if his heart was pounding, his hands, at least, were steady. 3 years of drilled discipline holding firm exactly when it mattered most. "Uzumaki Naruto," Iruka said, and there was something warm in the way he said it, an old, careful pride that had built itself slowly over years of watching a struggling student become something else entirely. "Whenever you're ready." He formed the seal, and the shadow clone appeared beside him, solid and perfect, an exact physical double rather than the faint, insubstantial illusion the standard technique produced. And the examination room went briefly, audibly quiet, several examiners exchanging glances that suggested they were witnessing something considerably more advanced than the exam typically called for. That's. One of the examiners began, then stopped, consulting notes that Irika had apparently prepared well in advance. This was authorized as an equivalent substitution. It was, Irika confirmed, unable to fully keep the satisfaction out of his voice. Given the student's exceptional chakra reserves, the standard technique was determined to be a poor fit rather than a genuine skill deficiency. This more than exceeds the equivalent standard. Naruto passed, not narrowly, but decisively, and walked out of the examination room with a forehead protector tied securely around his brow for the first time, the weight of it settling against his skin like something he'd been waiting his entire life to earn and had, in the end, earned entirely on his own merit, however much help had gone into building the foundation beneath it. Tsunade and Shizune were waiting outside the academy gates when the newly graduated students spilled out, and Naruto spotted them immediately, breaking into a run that closed the distance between them in seconds, forehead protector catching the afternoon light. I passed. Shadow clone worked perfectly. Irika-sensei looked so surprised, you should have seen everyone's faces. We saw yours, Shizune said, laughing, pulling him into a hug that he returned without a trace of the old hesitation that had once made every gesture of affection feel like something he needed to brace for. That's the only face that mattered today. Tsunade studied the forehead protector for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes, pride tangled together with an old, familiar fear she'd never fully managed to put down where shinobi she loved were concerned. Congratulations, Genin, she said finally, rough but warm. Try not to make me regret every single hour of training that got you here. No promises, Naruto said, grinning, and for one bright, uncomplicated afternoon, the future waiting beyond the academy gates felt like nothing more than a door he'd finally, deservedly, earned the right to walk through. That evening, the three of them celebrated with a dinner far more elaborate than their usual weeknight fare, Tsunade insisting on cooking despite Shizune's gentle protests that she was, by a considerable margin, the less reliable cook of the two of them. Naruto ate with the same unguarded enthusiasm he brought to every meal in that apartment, forehead protector still tied firmly in place even at the table, and when Shizune finally suggested, laughing, that he might want to take it off before it ended up in his soup, he refused with such genuine, stubborn pride that neither woman had the heart to insist. I earned it, he said simply. I'm not taking it off for a while. Later, alone in his room, he sat for a long time turning the metal plate over in his hands, tracing the engraved leaf symbol with his thumb, thinking not of the exam itself but of every morning over the past 3 years that had led to it, the 6 o'clock training sessions, the failed attempts and the slow, grinding correction, the two women who had, without ever once making him feel like a burden for needing it, rebuilt an entire childhood around him almost from scratch. Whatever waited beyond the academy gates, he understood, sitting there in the quiet of a room that had once felt too large for one small, lonely boy and now felt, most nights, exactly the right size for the family that filled it. He would be walking into it carrying more than just a headband. He would be carrying every single one of those mornings with him, and he intended, with the same stubbornness that had gotten him this far, to make every one of them count. Chapter 10. Team placements were announced 3 days later, in a classroom considerably quieter than it had been during the graduation exam itself, the nervous energy of testing replaced by a different, more settled kind of anticipation. Team 7, Irika read, from a list he'd clearly reviewed many times already, Uzumaki Naruto, Haruno Sakura, Uchiha Sasuke. Naruto's reaction, a fist pumped in triumph, drew an eye roll from Sakura and a flat, unreadable glance from Sasuke, though Naruto noticed, with some private satisfaction, that the glance carried less irritation in it than it might have 3 years earlier. Your Jonin instructor will meet you after lunch, Irika continued. I'd suggest patience. He has something of a reputation for being unpunctual. The reputation proved, if anything, understated. Team 7 waited in their assigned classroom for nearly 3 hours past the scheduled meeting time, long enough that Naruto had rigged an eraser trap above the door out of pure restless boredom, an old habit resurfacing that Sakura loudly predicted would only embarrass them in front of their new sensei. It embarrassed no one but the sensei himself, who walked directly into the trap without any apparent effort to avoid it, an eraser bouncing off silver hair with a soft thump that left Naruto laughing too hard to properly brace for the man's reaction. Kakashi Hatake regarded the three of them with a single visible eye, unreadable behind a mask that covered the lower half of his face, and something in his gaze lingered on Naruto for a beat longer than the introduction strictly required, an old, careful weight behind it that none of the genin were positioned to understand. "My first impression of you," he said finally, "is that I hate you all. Meet me on the roof." He was gone before any of them could respond, and the three genin exchanged bewildered glances before making their way upstairs, where Kakashi sat waiting, unhurried, watching the village spread out beneath them. "Let's start with introductions," he said. "Names, likes, dislikes, dreams for the future. You first, Pinky." Sakura's introduction was brief and, notably, entirely focused on Sasuke, drawing a faint, weary sigh from Kakashi that suggested he'd anticipated exactly this outcome. Sasuke's was shorter still, clipped and guarded, an ambition mentioned only in the vaguest terms that nonetheless carried a weight the whole rooftop seemed to feel. Naruto went last, and found himself, for the first time in front of a new authority figure, entirely unguarded about who he was. "I'm Naruto Uzumaki. I like ramen, training with my Bachan and Neichan, and I'm gonna be Hokage someday, so you should probably start remembering my name now, get ahead of the crowd." He grinned, unbothered by how it sounded, a confidence that had nothing performative left in it. "I dislike the 3 minutes it takes for instant ramen to cook. Feels like an eternity every single time." Kakashi's visible eye crinkled, something that might have been amusement, though it was quickly replaced by a more careful, considering expression, the look of a man doing arithmetic he'd clearly been doing, privately, for years before this exact moment arrived. He knew, better than most in the village, exactly what the boy in front of him carried, and exactly what debts of his own remained unpaid where the fourth Hokage's legacy was concerned. He had expected, walking into this assignment, to find a lonely, undertrained boy, a quiet continuation of years of village neglect he'd watched from a careful, guilty distance, and never once found the courage to interrupt. He had not expected this, a genin with genuine discipline, real skill, and an ease in his own skin that spoke of years of care Kakashi himself had played no part in providing. "All right," Kakashi said, filing the observation away for later, more private consideration. "Tomorrow, 6 in the morning, training ground 3. Don't eat breakfast, unless you'd like to see it again shortly after arriving." He vanished in a swirl of leaves before any of them could ask what, precisely, that ominous instruction meant, leaving 3 genin on a rooftop with a great deal to think about and, in Naruto's case at least, a quiet, unspoken curiosity about the strange, careful way his new sensei's single eye had lingered on him during introductions, as though searching for something he hadn't quite expected to find. Chapter 11. Naruto came home that evening full of the day's events, recounting the eraser trap and Kakashi's unreadable reaction with an enthusiasm that filled the small apartment with noise in the particular way Tsunade had, over 3 years, come to associate specifically with him, a sound she would have once found intolerable and now found she genuinely missed on the rare quiet evenings he wasn't there to make it. "Tomorrow's some kind of survival test," he said through a mouthful of dinner. "Kakashi-sensei said not to eat breakfast, which is definitely ominous, but I've got you too, so I figure I'll be fine no matter what it is." "A survival test," Tsunade repeated, something in her posture going carefully still. "At training ground 3, with Kakashi Hatake specifically." "Yeah, why?" "No reason," Tsunade said, though the look she exchanged with Shizune across the table said otherwise, a shared, wordless understanding of exactly what kind of test that particular training ground, under that particular instructor, was likely to entail. Later, after Naruto had gone to bed, still buzzing faintly with the day's excitement, Tsunade found herself sitting up long past her own usual hour, restless in a way training and card games alike had never quite been able to fully settle. "You're worried," Shizune observed, settling onto the floor beside her with 2 cups of tea. "I raised him to be a shinobi," Tsunade said. "I trained him myself, every single day, for 3 years, specifically so he'd be ready for exactly this. And now that it's actually happening, some part of me still wants to march down to that training ground tomorrow and make sure nothing in the world can touch him." "That's not weakness," Shizune said gently. "That's just what it feels like to actually love someone enough to be terrified for them. You knew this day was coming since the moment we decided to stay." Knowing it and living it turn out to be very different things. Tsunade wrapped both hands around her cup, staring into it rather than at Shizune, an old, careful vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show even now. I've buried people I loved before, Shizune. I know exactly what this profession can cost. I told myself, back at the start, that I was prepared for that risk when we took him in. I'm not certain, now that it's real, that anyone is ever actually prepared for it. He's not walking into this alone, Shizune said. He has Kakashi. He has a team. And he has 3 years of training that most genin his age would give anything for. That doesn't make the fear disappear. But it's not nothing either. Tsunade was quiet for a long moment, turning the reassurance over, accepting the shape of it even where it didn't fully reach the fear underneath. He's going to be tested tomorrow, she said finally, in every sense of the word. And I won't be there to see it, or to catch him if it goes badly. That's the part one don't think I was ever going to be fully ready for, no matter how many years I had to prepare. Then we'll be here when he gets home instead, Shizune said. However it goes. That's the part we still get to control. It was, Tsunade thought, watching the last of her tea go cold in her hands, a smaller kind of comfort than she wanted, and a truer one than most she'd been offered in a long time, and she carried it with her to bed that night, still restless, still afraid in the particular, helpless way of every parent who has ever had to watch a child walk toward a danger they cannot follow into, and found herself, despite everything, quietly, fiercely proud of exactly how far that walk had already carried him. Chapter 12. Danzo received word of Team 7's formation within a day of the assignment being finalized, and read the report with an attention considerably sharper than the news of a routine genin placement would typically merit. Kakashi Hatake was not, in Danzo's long assessment, a neutral choice of instructor. The man carried his own complicated history with the fourth Hokage's legacy, a debt of guilt and loyalty that made him simultaneously a valuable potential asset and an unpredictable variable, someone whose sympathies where the boy was concerned could not be reliably assumed to run through official channels rather than personal ones. More significant, in Danzo's careful calculation, was the timing. The boy was now, for the first time in his life, stepping beyond the protective perimeter Tsunade and Shizune had spent 3 years constructing around him, into missions, into danger, into a world where roots reach extended considerably further than it did into a private training ground guarded by a Sanin's watchful eye. He summoned the operative who had monitored the arrangement for 3 years, and listened to the full accounting of Naruto's progress with the same unhurried patience that had characterized every stage of his observation. The boy's control has become exceptional, the operative reported. Chakra reserves remain unmatched for his age, and his temperament, while still carrying some of his earlier impulsiveness, has developed genuine discipline under Tsunade's instruction. By any objective measure, he is developing into precisely the kind of asset this village will need in the years ahead. And his loyalties? Absolute, as far as can be observed. To Tsunade. To Shizune. Increasingly, based on today's team assignment, to his new genin teammates as well. There is no indication his loyalty extends meaningfully to the village as an abstract institution, separate from the specific people within it that he has come to love. Danzo absorbed this without visible reaction, though internally the assessment confirmed exactly the concern he had voiced to Hiruzen years earlier, now grown from a theoretical worry into an observable, hardening fact. A weapon devoted to people rather than to the village itself was a weapon whose reliability, in the moments that would eventually matter most, could not be guaranteed to align with what the village required of him. Continue observation, he said. But expand its scope. I want to know everything about the missions this team is assigned, and everything about how the boy performs under genuine danger rather than controlled training. If Tsunade's methods have produced the asset the reports suggest, the village should benefit from that asset's full potential. If they have produced instead a weapon that answers only to 2 women's affection rather than to Konoha's needs, that is a flaw that will require correction before it becomes a liability the village cannot afford. The operative bowed and withdrew, and Danzo sat alone in the quiet of his office for a long while afterward, turning the calculation over with the same cold patience that had guided every decision of his long, careful career. He was not, he reminded himself, an enemy of the boy, whatever conclusions a less careful observer might draw from his continued interest. He was, as he had always understood himself to be, a guardian of the village's true interests, willing to make hard decisions that softer men, Hiruzen among them, had never possessed the resolve to make themselves. If the day came that Naruto Uzumaki's loyalties needed realigning, gently if possible, more forcefully if necessary, Danzo intended to be ready for it, patient as ever, waiting for the moment the boy's growing strength and his still developing bonds intersected with a crisis significant enough to reveal, once and for all, exactly where his true loyalties would land. Outside his window, the village settled into an ordinary evening, unaware that in a modest apartment across town, a newly minted genin was recounting his first day as a shinobi to two women who loved him more than either had ever expected to love anyone again, and unaware, too, that somewhere beyond the reach of that warm, lit window, a much older, much colder set of calculations had already begun quietly reshaping itself around exactly how far that love might someday be tested. In the apartment itself, none of that shadow had yet reached. Naruto fell asleep that night with his new forehead protector set carefully on the nightstand where he could see it first thing in the morning, and Tsunade, checking on him one last time before retiring herself, stood in the doorway for a long moment simply watching him sleep, the particular vigilance of someone who understood, better than most, exactly how much the world beyond that door could take from a person who let their guard down too far. She did not yet know what shape the coming trials would take, or how soon the careful, quiet interest gathering somewhere in the village's older, more secretive corners would demand to be reckoned with. She knew only that she intended to meet whatever came with the same fierce, unwavering resolve that had carried her through every loss she'd survived before this family had given her a reason to keep fighting for something new, and she closed his door softly, already turning her mind toward tomorrow, and toward all the tomorrows still waiting beyond it. Act 3. Chapter 1. Training Ground 3, at 6 in the morning, was cold in the particular way early autumn mornings could be, and Naruto arrived with a full breakfast in his stomach despite Kakashi's explicit instructions, a small, deliberate rebellion he'd cleared with Tsunade the night before. He's testing whether you'll follow an instruction that doesn't make sense to you without asking why, she told him, over a dinner he'd eaten with more strategic intent than usual. Which means the instruction itself is the trap, not a genuine requirement. Eat. Trust your judgment. That's worth more in this exam than an empty stomach. Sakura and Sasuke, less informed, looked distinctly worse for the missed meal by the time Kakashi finally arrived, 2 bells jingling from his belt as he explained the actual stakes of the exercise. Only 2 of the 3 would pass, the third sent back to the academy, a genin team reduced by a third before it had even properly begun. It was, Naruto understood almost immediately, a lie designed to fracture them against each other, and he said as much, quietly, to Sasuke and Sakura the moment Kakashi disappeared to begin the test in earnest. He wants us fighting each other for the bells, Naruto said. That's gotta be the actual test. Teamwork, not competition. Why put us on a team at all if the point is to weed one of us out? Sasuke's eyes narrowed, turning the logic over with the same careful assessment he brought to everything, and Sakura, still recovering from the shock of the setup, nodded slowly. It does seem like a strange way to test 3 people at once if the actual goal is picking one winner. So we work together, Naruto said. Get both bells between the 3 of us, however that shakes out, and if he tries to fail one of us anyway for not technically having a bell, we point out we solved the problem better than the rules asked us to. It was not, in the end, a flawless plan. Kakashi remained, even against 3 genin working in concert, a jonin of considerable skill and experience, and the morning that followed involved more than one narrow escape, more than one moment where Sasuke's fireball technique, or Sakura's careful reconnaissance saved them from a mistake Naruto's more direct approach nearly walked them into. But it worked, in the way that mattered. By the time the timer's bell rang, marking the exercise's end, Naruto had used a small army of shadow clones to overwhelm Kakashi's attention just long enough for Sasuke to lift both bells cleanly from his belt, a maneuver that required exactly the kind of trust in a teammate's ability that the test had been designed, cynically, to make nearly impossible. Kakashi studied the 3 of them afterward, an unreadable expression settling behind his mask, and let a long silence stretch before he spoke. In the history of this test, he said finally, you're the first team to figure out the actual objective before the time ran out. Most genin spend the whole exercise fighting each other for bells that were never going to save them individually anyway. So we pass? Sakura asked, hopeful and still slightly breathless. You pass. Something in Kakashi's visible eye crinkled close to approval. Those who abandon the mission are trash. But those who abandon their comrades are worse than trash. Remember that. It's the only lesson today actually mattered for. Naruto grinned, exhausted and thoroughly pleased with himself, and glanced towards Sasuke, who offered, in return, something that was almost a genuine smile, a small, real acknowledgement of a plan that had worked because all three of them had trusted it enough to commit. Team 7, Kakashi said, gathering his things. Officially operational, as of this morning. Try to keep the collaborative spirit going. I have a feeling we're going to need it. He had no way of knowing, watching the three genin celebrate their first genuine victory together, how quickly that particular prediction would prove correct, or how far beyond the training ground the test still waiting for them would eventually reach. Naruto returned home that evening buzzing with an energy Tsunade recognized immediately as the particular pride of a hard-won, cooperative victory, and listened to his full, animated account of the morning with the patient attention she'd cultivated over years of hearing about his triumphs and setbacks alike. You figured out the actual test, she said, once he'd finished, something approving in her voice. That's not a small thing, Naruto. A lot of genin spend years learning what you three worked out in a single morning. It felt kind of obvious once we talked it through, Naruto said, still riding the high of the day. I mean, why would he put us on a team just to make us fight each other? That never made sense. Plenty of people never stop to ask whether the framing of a problem is the actual problem, Tsunade said. You did. Remember that instinct. It'll serve you well beyond just bell tests. Chapter 2. The weeks that followed brought Team 7 a steady diet of D-rank missions, the unglamorous backbone of a genin's early career, and Naruto discovered quickly that catching a runaway cat named Tora was, against all reasonable expectation, considerably more dangerous than several of the training exercises Tsunade had put him through over the preceding years. That cat, he announced, nursing a fresh set of scratches after their third attempt at the mission that month, is stronger than half the academy graduates I know. It's not strength, Sakura said, unwrapping a bandage with more patience than sympathy. It's that you keep trying to grab it head-on instead of using a clone to flank it. You've had this exact solution available for months. I know that now, Naruto muttered, and privately resolved to remember it before the mission's inevitable fourth attempt, which arrived, predictably, the following week. Kakashi observed these missions with a detachment that Naruto initially read as boredom, and gradually came to understand as something closer to careful evaluation, the man's single visible eye tracking not just the mission's completion but the small, incremental ways his three genin adjusted to working as an actual unit rather than three individuals occupying the same assignment. It was during a particularly mundane afternoon spent weeding an elderly farmer's garden that Kakashi found a moment alone with Naruto, the other two occupied on the far side of the field, and asked, with a casualness that didn't quite mask the weight underneath it, how his training with Tsunade had gone over the years. Really good, actually. Naruto pulled another weed, warming to the subject the way he warmed to most subjects involving people he loved. She's tough, but she's fair. Shizune too. They basically taught me everything I know. I imagine that's true, Kakashi said, something careful in his tone. You're fortunate to have found people who invested that much in you. Yeah. Naruto glanced over, catching something in Kakashi's expression that he couldn't quite place, a weight that seemed disproportionate to the casual question that had prompted it. You okay, sensei? You've got a weird look. I'm fine. Kakashi's eye crinkled into something that might have been a smile, though it didn't fully reach past the mask covering the rest of his expression. Just thinking that you remind me of someone I used to know. In a good way. Who? Someone important, Kakashi said, and did not elaborate further, and Naruto, sensing the boundary without fully understanding its source, let the question drop, filing the strange exchange away the way he filed most puzzling adult behavior, patiently, for a day when the pieces might make more sense. He mentioned it to Tsunade that evening regardless, describing the odd, weighted look on Kakashi's face, and watched something flicker across her own expression before she smoothed it back into careful neutrality. Kakashi's had a complicated life, she said, choosing her words with more care than the casual dinner conversation initially seemed to warrant. He carries some old grief that isn't really mine to explain. Give him time, if he wants to talk about it. Some things take longer to say out loud than others. Naruto nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further, though something about the careful way both Tsunade and Kakashi seemed to be circling a subject either would name directly stayed with him longer than the conversation itself, a small, persistent curiosity he tucked away alongside every other unanswered question about his own history, patient in the particular way he'd learned to be about things that mattered too much to rush. The D-rank missions continued for weeks after that, unremarkable in themselves, but building, mission by tedious mission, the kind of practice coordination that would matter considerably more than any of them yet understood, once the mission stopped being unremarkable at all. There were other small moments woven through those weeks that Naruto would only later understand as significant. Sasuke, initially standoffish about anything resembling genuine teamwork, began, gradually, to trust Naruto's instincts in ways that went beyond the calculated necessity of the bell test, occasionally deferring to a read on a situation that Naruto's more instinctive, people-focused training had sharpened in ways Sasuke's own more solitary discipline hadn't developed. Sakura, for her part, found herself increasingly drawn into genuine friendship with both of her teammates rather than the singular fixation on Sasuke that had defined her academy years, a shift she attributed, when she thought about it honestly, to watching Naruto treat every mission, however tedious, with a sincerity that made it hard to remain simply an observer of her own team rather than an active part of it. "You've gotten less annoying," she told him bluntly, one afternoon after a particularly grueling delivery mission that had taken them halfway across the village and back on foot. "I'm choosing to take that as a compliment," Naruto said, grinning, and Sakura, despite herself, found she couldn't entirely disagree with the framing. Chapter 3. Naruto's request for a more challenging mission came, as such requests typically did from him, without much diplomatic finesse, delivered directly to the Hokage during a mission assignment meeting with an enthusiasm that made Irika, present as an observer, visibly wince. "We've caught that cat like 6 times now," Naruto said. "I think we're ready for something that isn't a pet or someone's garden. Come on, old man, give us something real." "Naruto," Kakashi said, mild reproach threaded through clear amusement, "that's not how you address the Hokage." "It's fine," Hiruzen said, and there was genuine fondness in it, the particular indulgence he reserved almost exclusively for the boy in front of him. "I've had worse requests delivered with considerably less charm. As it happens, a C-rank mission has come across my desk that might suit your team's growing capabilities." The client, an older man named Tsunade, arrived shortly after, and made no effort to hide his skepticism at the sight of 3 genin assigned to what he described, somewhat vaguely, as a straightforward escort mission back to his home in the Land of Waves, where he claimed to need protection while completing a bridge that would, in his telling, restore prosperity to a struggling region. "Kids," he muttered, not quite under his breath, eyeing Naruto with particular doubt. "This one especially looks like he'd trip over his own feet in a real fight." "He'd be wrong about that," Kakashi said mildly, though something in the way he said it suggested a private amusement at exactly how wrong Tsunade's assessment was likely to prove. Naruto, for his part, chose not to dignify the insult with an immediate retort, a restraint that surprised even Sasuke, who had spent enough time around him by now to recognize the visible effort it took. Preparations moved quickly once the mission was formally approved, and Naruto found himself, that evening, packing for his first assignment outside the village walls under the watchful, careful supervision of 2 women trying, with only partial success, to disguise how much the moment weighed on them. "Standard field kit," Tsunade said, checking his pack with the thoroughness of someone who had packed for missions herself more times than she could count. "Extra bandages, soldier pills, the emergency chakra suppressant seal I taught you last month in case something goes badly wrong with your control under stress." "I know, Bachan. I've been over this list like 4 times already." "Then you can stand to hear it a 5th," she said, though her hands, checking each item, weren't quite as steady as her voice. Shizune pressed a small, carefully wrapped bundle into his hands as he prepared to leave the following morning, a set of field medical supplies she'd assembled herself, more thorough and better organized than the standard kit any genin typically carried. Just in case, she said. I know Kakashi will look after you. I'd just feel better knowing you had everything you might need regardless. I'll be fine, Naruto said, softer than his usual bravado, recognizing, even at 12, exactly what the gesture cost her to make without falling apart over it. I promise. I've got the best training in the village behind me. Nothing's gonna catch me off guard that you two didn't already prepare me for. It was, in the end, a promise he mostly kept, though not without cost, and not without the mission ahead teaching him things about the world, and about himself, that no amount of training in a familiar village training ground could ever have fully prepared him for. The gates of Konoha closed behind Team 7 that morning, and Naruto, walking beside Sasuke and Sakura toward a horizon he'd never crossed before, felt something settle into place inside him that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the particular, fierce readiness of someone finally stepping into the life he'd spent years preparing for. Sasuke walked a few paces ahead, characteristically quiet, though Naruto caught him glancing back once, a small, unspoken acknowledgement of a shared moment neither needed to comment on directly. Sakura, for her part, seemed to be cataloging every unfamiliar tree and landmark with the meticulous attention of someone determined not to be caught unprepared by anything the journey might present, a nervous energy that Naruto found, to his own mild surprise, more endearing than irritating now that months of shared missions had worn away his earlier, more reflexive need for her approval. Kakashi brought up the rear, unhurried as ever, though Naruto noticed, glancing back more than once, that his sensei's usual air of relaxed detachment carried a watchfulness beneath it that hadn't been quite so present during their D-rank missions closer to home. It was a small thing, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, but Naruto had spent years learning to read the adults around him for exactly this kind of quiet signal, and he filed the observation away, uncertain yet what it might mean, but confident, from long practice, that it would matter eventually. Chapter 4. The attack came 2 days into the journey, quiet enough that Naruto nearly missed the signs Tsunade had spent years teaching him to notice. A puddle on a dry road, wrong in a way that registered a half-second before the two figures burst from beneath it, chains whipping between them fast enough to catch Kakashi off guard and, for one heart-stopping moment, tear him apart in a spray that left all three genin frozen in horror. It was Naruto who moved first, some instinct honed by years of careful, deliberate training overriding the shock, throwing himself between the attackers and Tsunade with a shadow clone already forming at his side before conscious thought had fully caught up with reflex. The two Chunin, missing Nin known as the Demon Brothers, found themselves facing considerably more resistance than a straightforward genin escort mission should have offered, and the fight that followed, brief and brutal, ended with both brothers subdued, one restrained by a combination of Naruto's clones and Sasuke's precise, controlled strikes. The other caught in a binding technique Sakura executed with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Kakashi reappeared moments later, entirely unharmed, the destroyed clone having been exactly the substitution technique it appeared, and studied the scene with an expression that mixed genuine approval with something more sober underneath it. Good work, he said. All three of you. But I need to know now, honestly, whether any of you want to abandon this mission. This was supposed to be a C-rank escort. Missing Nin Chunin targeting our client means the mission's actual rank was misrepresented, deliberately or otherwise, and I want you to understand exactly what continuing means before we take another step toward wave. He turned to Tsunade, who had gone pale and visibly guilty under the weight of the implied question, and the older man's confession followed quickly. A tyrant named Gato, controlling Wave's economy through fear and violence, had every reason to want the bridge Tsunade was building stopped by any means available, missing Nin included, and Tsunade had, in his desperation, understated the mission's true danger to secure a rate he could actually afford. I'm sorry, Tsunade said, shame plain in his voice. I didn't have the money for a higher rank mission, and I really didn't think, that Gato would go this far. If you want to turn back, I understand. I have no right to ask you to keep risking your lives for a mission I lied about. Naruto looked at Sasuke, then at Sakura, reading in both of their faces the same conclusion he'd already reached himself, and found, when he spoke, that the decision required no real deliberation at all. "We're not turning back," he said. "You've got a whole country counting on that bridge, right? People who need it. We're shinobi. This is exactly the kind of thing we're supposed to help with, misrepresented rank, or not." "Naruto's right," Sasuke said, quiet but firm. "We came this far. Turning back now because the mission got harder isn't something I'm willing to do." Sakura nodded, steadying herself visibly even as fear remained plain in her eyes. "We'll finish it. Together." Kakashi studied his three genin for a long moment, something that might have been pride settling behind his careful, guarded expression, and nodded once, decisive. "Then we continue," he said. "But we do it with clear eyes about what we're walking into. Gato won't stop at 2 Chunin. If he's this determined, he'll send stronger opposition next, and I want every one of you ready for that possibility rather than surprised by it." They set off again within the hour, the journey's earlier ease replaced by a wary, watchful tension that none of them fully shook until Wave's coastline finally came into view, and Naruto, walking in step with teammates, he was beginning to trust in a way that went well beyond the calculated teamwork of the bell test, understood, for the first time in his young shinobi career, exactly how much weight the word mission could actually carry when circumstances demanded it. The demon brothers themselves, bound and left for the tracking teams that would eventually collect them, offered little further trouble, though Naruto found himself turning the fight over in his mind for much of the remaining walk, replaying the moment he'd stepped forward without conscious thought, the way years of drilled instinct had simply taken over where deliberate calculation would have cost too much time. It was, he realized, exactly what Tsunade had meant, all those training sessions ago, about muscle memory mattering more than clever plans in the moments when there wasn't time to think one through. He wished, walking the rest of the way to Wave with that realization settling into him, that he'd had the chance to tell her so before leaving, though he suspected, knowing her, that she already understood it better than he did. Chapter 5. Zabuza Momochi announced himself the way legends often did, with an entrance that stopped the entire group cold, a wall of mist rolling in from nowhere, thick enough to swallow the surrounding forest, and a voice, calm and unhurried, cutting through it from a direction none of them could immediately pinpoint. "Kakashi of the Sharingan," the voice said, amused. "I'd heard you were escorting the bridge builder. Didn't expect the honor of facing you personally over something this small." Kakashi's posture shifted immediately, a controlled tension settling over him that Naruto had never seen from his usually relaxed sensei, and the protective seriousness in his voice when he spoke next carried a weight that made all three genin instinctively close ranks around Tsunade. "Formation A," Kakashi said. "Protect the client. This is not a fight for genin, not against him." Zabuza emerged from the mist a moment later, an enormous cleaver of a blade resting against his shoulder, bandages wrapped across the lower half of his face in a way that gave him an unsettling resemblance, Naruto thought with a flicker of dark humor even through his fear, to Kakashi's own mask. The fight that followed unfolded at a speed and intensity none of the genin had ever witnessed up close, Kakashi's Sharingan tracking Zabuza's movements with a precision that nonetheless seemed, more than once, barely sufficient against an opponent operating at a level genuinely beyond anything the genin had trained to face. It was during the fight's most dangerous turn, Zabuza's water prison technique closing around Kakashi and rendering him helpless, immobilized while a water clone advanced on the genin and their client, that Naruto felt something in him shift, old instinct and years of careful training crystallizing into a single, unhesitating decision. "Sasuke, Sakura, protect Tsunade," he said, already forming the seal for his shadow clone technique, a dozen copies springing into being around him in an instant. "I'll handle the clone." It was, in the end, not quite enough on its own, the water clone proving durable and dangerous even against the small army of shadow clones, but it bought precious seconds Sasuke used to drive the clone back with a series of precise strikes, seconds that gave Kakashi, still trapped, the narrow window he needed to shout instructions that ultimately freed him from the water prison through a coordinated effort none of the three genin could have managed independently. The real Zabuza, forced back by Kakashi's sudden freedom and the combined resistance of a team considerably more capable than he'd apparently anticipated, retreated into the mist as abruptly as he'd arrived, though not before a masked figure, arriving from the tree-line with speed that startled even Kakashi, intervened with a pair of saban that appeared to strike true, leaving Zabuza apparently lifeless on the ground. A hunter nin, Kakashi said, watching the masked figure retrieve the body with clinical efficiency before vanishing into the trees. Tracking and eliminating missing nin is their entire purpose. It seems our problem has resolved itself. He collapsed shortly after, chakra exhaustion from the Sharingan's overuse catching up with him all at once, and the genin found themselves, for the first time, genuinely responsible for their sensei's safety rather than the reverse. A role reversal that settled over all three of them with a gravity none had fully anticipated feeling this early in their careers. Naruto, helping carry Kakashi toward Tsunade's home with Sasuke's assistance, found himself turning the fight over and over in his mind, the fear of it, the helplessness of watching Kakashi trapped and unable to help, and beneath all of it, a fierce, clarifying resolve that had nothing to do with recklessness and everything to do with a decision he made, silently, somewhere in the walk back. He would never again be the reason a fight like that one went badly for the people he cared about. Whatever training had gotten him this far, it wasn't finished yet, not by a long distance. Sakura, walking a few steps behind with a watchfulness that hadn't been part of her usual demeanor before this mission, found herself thinking something similar, though the shape of her own resolve differed from Naruto's in its particulars. She had spent the fight feeling, more acutely than she wanted to admit, the gap between her current skill and the level the mission had suddenly demanded of all of them, and rather than let that gap discourage her, she found it hardening, uncomfortably but usefully, into a determination to close it as quickly as she possibly could. She said as much to Sasuke that evening, quietly, once Kakashi had been settled and the immediate crisis had passed. I felt useless out there, she admitted. I want that to stop being true. Then train harder, Sasuke said, without much softness, though there was something almost encouraging in the bluntness of it, an acknowledgement that he took her ambition seriously enough not to dress it up in false comfort. We all have work to do. Might as well start now. Chapter 6. Zabuza, Kakashi explained the following morning, weak but recovering, was very much alive, the hunter nin's intervention almost certainly a rescue rather than an execution, the senbon placed with precision suggesting a technique designed to simulate death without actually inflicting it, a fact that meant the true confrontation still waited somewhere ahead of them rather than behind. He'll need time to recover, same as I do, Kakashi said, propped against a wall in Tsunade's modest home, one visible eye tired but sharp. Which gives us a window. I intend to make sure all three of you are considerably stronger by the time he's ready to try again. The training that followed introduced the genin to tree climbing without hands, a deceptively simple exercise and precise, sustained chakra control that Naruto, to his own genuine surprise, found himself picking up faster than either of his teammates, years of Tsunade's exacting instruction paying dividends in a discipline he'd once struggled with more than almost anything else. You're better at this than me, Sasuke said, watching Naruto scale a trunk with a steadiness that had taken Sasuke considerably longer to achieve, and there was no bitterness in the observation, just a flat, genuine surprise that had, over the months of their partnership, gradually replaced whatever reflexive rivalry might once have colored the comment. Years of practice, Naruto said, grinning, though he was careful, this time, not to gloat too openly, a restraint that would have been unthinkable in the boy he'd been before Tsunade's training had reshaped not just his skills but his instincts about how to hold his own strength. You'll get there. You're already close. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt, despite the danger still gathering somewhere beyond Tsunade's walls, almost peaceful. Training by day, recovery and quiet meals by evening, the genin growing steadily closer through shared exhaustion and shared purpose in a way that no amount of D-rank missions back in the village could have replicated. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Naruto met Inari, Tsunade's grandson, a boy whose grief over his stepfather's death at Gato's hands had curdled into a bitter, defeated conviction that heroism was a fiction adults told children to keep them compliant. You don't understand anything, Inari said, when Naruto tried clumsily but sincerely to offer some encouragement about the bridge and what it might mean for the village's future. You've never lost anything. You don't know what it's like to have someone you love taken from you and realize there's nothing you can do about it. Naruto was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had none of its usual bravado, something older and more careful in its place. I grew up with nobody, he said. No parents, no family, for 8 years, in a village that mostly acted like I wasn't worth the trouble of caring about. I know exactly what it's like to feel like the world's already decided how your story ends. But I got lucky. 2 people decided I was worth fighting for anyway, and everything about my life since then has been proof that things can actually change, even after they've felt hopeless for a really long time. I'm not saying that to make what happened to you feel small. I'm saying it because I need you to know that giving up on hope isn't the only option left, even when it feels like it is. Inari didn't respond, not that evening, storming off with the particular defensiveness of someone whose grief wasn't ready to be reasoned with yet, but Naruto noticed, over the following days, the boy watching the genin's training from a distance with an attention that hadn't been there before, something in his carefully guarded posture beginning, slowly and unevenly, to shift. Naruto recognized the shape of that shift better than anyone else in the house might have, having lived through a version of it himself, and found himself, without fully planning to, taking on a quiet, patient responsibility toward Inari's healing that mirrored, in its own small way, everything Tsunade and Shizune had once patiently offered him. He found small ways to include the boy over the following days, teaching him a simplified version of a chakra exercise despite Inari having no shinobi training to speak of, mostly as an excuse to spend time together without the pressure of a direct conversation about grief that Inari clearly wasn't ready to have head-on. Tsunami, Inari's mother, noticed the change with quiet gratitude, mentioning to Kakashi one evening that her son had spoken more in the past few days than he had in the months since his stepfather's death, a small but meaningful shift that none of the adults in the house had managed to produce on their own despite considerable effort. He's good with people who are hurting, Kakashi observed to Sasuke and Sakura one evening, watching Naruto and Inari attempt, with mixed success, to skip stones across the nearby inlet. I suspect that comes from first-hand experience rather than any technique either of you could train for directly. Sasuke said nothing, but he watched the exchange for longer than the moment strictly required, some old, private recognition of his own grief moving behind his usually guarded expression, a kinship with Naruto's account of loneliness that he had never quite found words to voice aloud, not even to himself. Chapter 7. Naruto met Haku before he understood who Haku was. An unremarkable encounter in a quiet forest clearing that would, in hindsight, take on considerably more weight than either of them could have anticipated in the moment. He'd wandered off after an exhausting training session, restless energy still humming through him despite the day's efforts, and found a young, gentle-faced stranger gathering herbs with a calm, deliberate patience that felt like a balm after the tension of recent days. "You're not from around here," Haku observed, without looking up from the herbs, a soft, androgynous voice that Naruto, still catching his breath from the walk, found immediately easy to talk to. "Nah, I'm a shinobi from Konoha. Here on a mission." Naruto settled onto a nearby rock, unbothered by the stranger's initial lack of curiosity about that detail. "You live around here?" "Somewhere nearby, yes." Haku's dark eyes lifted briefly, taking Naruto in with an assessment that felt, in retrospect, considerably more thorough than the casual conversation suggested at the time. "You look tired. Training hard for something specific?" "Yeah. Gotta get stronger before a fight that's coming. Someone I care about almost died protecting us, and I don't ever want to be in a position again where I can't do enough to stop that from happening to someone I love." Haku was quiet for a moment, something contemplative moving across an expression that carried, Naruto would later understand, considerably more grief than its calm surface initially revealed. "Do you have someone precious to you? Someone worth protecting above everything else?" "Yeah." The answer came without hesitation, an image of Tsunade and Shizune rising immediately to mind, alongside, more recently, the faces of a Jonin sensei and 2 teammates he'd come to genuinely care about over the past several months. "A lot of people, actually. That's kind of the whole reason I want to get stronger in the first place. I think," Haku said slowly, "that a person becomes truly strong only when they have someone precious to protect. Not through skill alone. Through what that skill is actually for." The words settled into Naruto with a weight he didn't fully understand yet, and he found himself nodding, something in the stranger's quiet conviction resonating with an understanding he'd built, slowly, over years of his own hard-won family. "That's exactly it," he said. "That's exactly what I've been trying to figure out how to say." They talked a while longer, Haku's calm, careful presence oddly restorative after days of tension, and it was only after they parted, Naruto walking back toward Tsunade's house with a lighter step than he'd had in days, that a colder thought settled into him. Something about the encounter, replayed in his mind, had felt less like chance than either of them had let on in the moment. He mentioned the meeting to Kakashi that evening, describing the stranger's face and demeanor in enough detail that his sensei's expression sharpened considerably partway through the account. "That was almost certainly Zabuza's companion," Kakashi said grimly. "The hunter Nin who intervened in our fight. Which means Zabuza's alive, recovering, exactly as I suspected, and considerably closer to us than any of us would like." "He seemed nice," Naruto said, quiet, turning the realization over with a complicated mix of feelings he hadn't expected the day's encounter to leave him with. "Whoever he was, he didn't seem like an enemy. People can be genuinely kind and still stand opposed to you when the moment demands it," Kakashi said, not unkindly. "That's one of the harder lessons this profession teaches, and I'm sorry you're learning it this early. But it doesn't make the danger any less real. Be ready. I suspect the real confrontation isn't far off now." Naruto nodded, and that night, lying awake longer than usual, found himself thinking not of the coming fight, but of the strange, gentle conviction in Haku's voice, a person who understood something true about strength and precious bonds, and who was, apparently, standing on the opposite side of whatever battle waited for them next. He thought, too, about the particular ache of the conversation, the recognition that kindness and enmity could apparently share the same quiet clearing without either party fully understanding what the other represented, a lesson that unsettled him more than any training exercise Tsunade had ever put him through. He had grown up learning, slowly and painfully, that the village's fear of him had rarely reflected anything true about who he actually was. It had not occurred to him, until tonight, that the reverse could be equally true, that a genuinely gentle person could still, through loyalty and circumstance, end up standing against everything he cared about protecting. It was a harder, more complicated shape of the world than the simple stories he'd once told himself about good and bad, and he suspected, drifting finally toward an uneasy sleep, that it wouldn't be the last time the shinobi life asked him to hold two contradictory truths at once. Chapter 8. Word of Team 7's mission reached Danzo through channels considerably faster than the official reporting structure would have allowed, a network of quiet, unacknowledged eyes that had, over the years, come to cover far more of the village's shinobi activity than Hiruzen either knew or would have sanctioned. The report, when it arrived, contained details significant enough to warrant Danzo's full, undivided attention. A C-rank mission escalated to something far more dangerous, a confrontation with the missing Nin Zabuza Momochi, and most notably, a performance from the Jinchuriki that exceeded, by a considerable margin, what Danzo's careful, years-long observation had led him to expect from a genin barely months into active service. He held a water clone at bay with clones of his own, the operative reported, kneeling in the dim quiet of Danzo's private quarters. Coordinated effectively with his teammates under genuine combat stress, rather than the controlled conditions of academy training. His instincts, by every account gathered, were sound rather than merely reckless. Danzo absorbed this with the same unhurried attention he brought to every report concerning the boy, turning the information over against years of careful, patient calculation. The training had produced, exactly as he'd suspected it might, an asset of genuine and growing value, discipline and raw power combining in a way that few genin his age could match. The question that remained, unanswered and increasingly urgent in Danzo's private assessment, was whether that asset's growing capability would ultimately serve the village's true interests, or remain permanently, immovably tethered to the two women who had shaped it. "Continue full observation through the remainder of the mission," he said. "I want a complete account of how the boy handles whatever confrontation remains ahead. Combat under genuine, sustained danger reveals a shinobi's true character more reliably than any controlled test ever could." The operative bowed and withdrew, and Danzo sat alone afterward, turning a familiar, patient calculation over in his mind. He had, for 6 years now, watched this particular situation develop from a careful distance, weighing intervention against patience at every stage, and finding, each time, that patience continued to yield more useful information than any premature action would have provided. That patience, he understood, could not extend indefinitely. The boy was growing stronger, and more capable, and more deeply entwined with a web of loyalties. Tsunade, Shizune, now apparently a Jonin sensei and 2 genin teammates as well, that made any future attempt at redirection considerably more complicated with each passing month. There would come a point, Danzo suspected, where the cost of continued patience would begin to outweigh the value of the information it continued to provide. He was not there yet. But the horizon of that calculation, he understood, watching Wave's mission reports accumulate with a growing, undeniable weight, had begun, gradually and unmistakably, to draw nearer. One further instruction, he told the operative, before the man could fully withdraw. Begin a discreet inventory of what circumstances, precisely, might someday justify direct intervention in the boy's development. I do not intend to act rashly. But I have learned, across a very long career, that failing to prepare for a contingency is its own kind of recklessness, and I do not intend to be caught unprepared, whatever shape the future eventually takes. The operative bowed a final time and was gone, and Danzo returned to the quiet, patient work that had defined his entire career, watching, waiting, and preparing, with the same cold, careful diligence he had always brought to matters he considered essential to the village's survival, for a moment that had not yet arrived, but that he was increasingly certain, watching the reports from Wave accumulate on his desk, was drawing closer than either Tsunade or Hiruzen currently understood. He allowed himself, in the privacy of that quiet office, a rare moment of genuine reflection on the years that had passed since he'd first begun monitoring the arrangement. He had expected, at various points along the way, that circumstance would force his hand sooner than this, that some failure of Tsunade's guardianship, or some crisis within the village would present the clean, justifiable opening he required. None had come. The boy had simply grown, steadily and remarkably, into precisely the asset the village would need, shaped by hands other than his own, and Danzo found himself, for the first time in a very long career built on certainty, genuinely uncertain what the correct path forward actually was. Chapter 9. The mist rolled in over the unfinished bridge at dawn, thick and deliberate, and Naruto understood, the moment it settled around them, that whatever quiet recovery period they'd been granted had finally, decisively ended. Zabuza emerged first, considerably recovered from their previous encounter, his massive blade resting against his shoulder with the same casual menace as before, and behind him, stepping out with the same calm, gentle presence Naruto had spoken with in the forest, came Haku, mask now covering a face that had, days earlier, offered him quiet wisdom about precious bonds without either of them understanding the collision course they were on. So we meet again, Kakashi said, settling into a ready stance beside his genin, Sharingan already active. I'd hoped for a bit more recovery time before round 2. Recovery's overrated, Zabuza said. Especially when there's a bridge builder still very much alive that my employer would prefer otherwise. The fight split almost immediately, Kakashi engaging Zabuza directly while Haku, moving with a speed that startled all 3 genin, erected a dome of ice mirrors around Sasuke with a technique none of them had ever seen or trained against, a crystalline prison that left Sasuke isolated and for several dangerous minutes, entirely on his own against an opponent who seemed to exist simultaneously in every reflective surface at once. Naruto's instinct was immediate and unhesitating. He threw himself toward the ice dome, intent on breaking through to help, and found himself, moments later, trapped inside it alongside Sasuke, Haku's speed proving more than sufficient to redirect his charge into the very danger he'd meant to prevent. You're the one from the forest, Haku said, voice muffled behind the mask but unmistakable, something like regret threading through the calm delivery. I am sorry it has come to this. But Zabuza is precious to me, in exactly the way we discussed. I intend to protect him, whatever that requires. Then we're kind of stuck, aren't we? Naruto said, breathing hard, Saban already grazing his shoulder from an attack he'd barely registered in time to avoid entirely. Because Sasuke's precious to me too. And I'm not gonna just stand here and let you hurt him. What followed tested every hour of training Tsunade had poured into him over 6 years: chakra control under genuine, escalating danger, coordination with a teammate whose own considerable skill was, for the first time, genuinely insufficient against an opponent operating at this level. Sasuke's Sharingan awakened partway through the exchange, a development that startled even Haku, granting him just enough predictive advantage to keep pace, though not enough, on its own, to turn the fight decisively in their favor. It was Naruto's endurance, ultimately, that shifted the balance, an unrelenting stream of shadow clones absorbing hit after hit that would have ended the fight against any opponent with less monstrous reserves to draw from, wearing down Haku's own considerable stamina through sheer, stubborn attrition rather than any single decisive technique. "You won't stop," Haku said, something almost admiring beneath the exhaustion creeping into the observation. "Why? I could kill you, eventually, if this continues. Why keep coming back?" "Because giving up isn't something I know how to do anymore," Naruto said, breathing hard, another clone forming at his side despite the mounting toll. "Not since some people taught me it was worth trying, even when trying hurts. I'm not gonna let you hurt Sasuke." "That's it. That's the whole reason." Outside the ice dome, Kakashi's fight with Zabuza had reached its own dangerous crescendo, and somewhere beyond the mist, Sakura stood guard over Tsunade against a small army of Gato's hired thugs, the entire bridge transformed, in the space of a single morning, into a battlefield that would determine considerably more than any of them had fully understood when the mission began. Sakura's part of the fight, less visible to Naruto but no less significant, tested a different set of skills than the raw endurance being demanded of him inside the ice dome. Gato's men were not shinobi, but they were numerous and desperate, and it was her careful, precise application of a genjutsu she'd only recently mastered that kept Tsunade safe through the fight's most dangerous opening minutes, a contribution that would go largely unnoticed in the retelling of the day's events but that Kakashi, catching glimpses of it between his own exchanges with Zabuza, recognized as exactly the kind of unglamorous, essential competence that separated genuinely capable shinobi from merely flashy ones. Inside the ice dome, the exchange between Naruto and Haku continued its brutal, exhausting rhythm, each clone Naruto sacrificed buying him precious seconds of information about the mirror's pattern, a puzzle he worked at with the same stubborn, methodical persistence Tsunade had spent years cultivating in him. He had not yet solved it fully. But he was close enough that Haku's usually unbroken calm had begun, almost imperceptibly, to fray at its edges. Chapter 10. The moment that changed everything arrived without warning, Zabuza's blade cutting through the mist toward Kakashi with a speed that would have proven fatal had Haku not appeared between them at the last possible instant, a decision that startled even Zabuza, whose voice, when he finally spoke, carried something raw and unpracticed beneath its usual cold control. Naruto watched, frozen, as Haku's mask shattered and the ice dome around him and Sasuke dissolved, its creator's attention entirely consumed by the desperate gambit to protect a man he'd called precious only days before. Kakashi's technique, already committed, found its mark before the sudden shift in the fight's dynamics could be fully processed by anyone present, and Haku fell, the sacrifice complete before Naruto had even finished closing the distance to intervene. Something in Naruto broke at the sight of it, grief and fury tangled together in a way that momentarily overwhelmed every careful lesson about control Tsunade had spent years instilling, and he found himself shouting at Zabuza with a rawness that surprised even him, demanding to know how the man could have let someone who loved him that much die without a single visible flicker of the grief the moment demanded. Zabuza's answer, when it came, arrived stripped of its usual mercenary detachment, an old, buried humanity surfacing too late to matter for the boy who had died protecting him. He turned on Gato himself moments later, the mercenary having arrived with his hired thugs expecting to oversee a clean, uncomplicated betrayal, and the fight that followed, brief and merciless, ended with Zabuza mortally wounded but victorious, Gato's tyranny over Wave concluding in the same violent, unglamorous manner it had been in force for years. "Take care of the boy," Zabuza said to Kakashi, in the last exchange either of them would share, gesturing weakly toward Haku's body. "He deserved better than what I gave him. Bury us together, if it's not too much trouble. It's the least I owe him now." He died shortly after, and the mist that had rolled over the bridge that morning cleared, at last, into an unremarkable, overcast sky, revealing a battlefield that had cost considerably more than any of them had anticipated when the mission first began. Naruto stood over Haku's body for a long moment afterward, the words from their forest conversation returning to him with a weight he hadn't fully understood until now. A person becomes truly strong only when they have someone precious to protect. Haku had lived and died by exactly that conviction, and Naruto found himself, grieving a boy he'd known for less than a week, unable to fully separate his sorrow from a deeper, more unsettling recognition of how easily their positions might have been reversed, had circumstance shaped his own precious bonds differently. He wasn't a bad person, Naruto said quietly, to Kakashi, once the others had moved off to check on Tsunade and the villagers gathering at the bridge's edge. He just loved the wrong person the wrong way. That's not really so different from anyone else who's ever loved somebody, is it? Kakashi studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his single visible eye, old grief of his own surfacing alongside a genuine, careful pride in the boy standing before him. No, he said finally. It isn't so different at all. I think that's a harder lesson than most genin learn this early in their careers, Naruto. I'm sorry the world decided to teach it to you so soon. They buried Zabuza and Haku together, as requested, at the edge of the forest overlooking the bridge that would, in the months ahead, finally be completed, and Naruto stood at the graveside longer than the others, quiet in a way that carried none of his usual restless energy, carrying the weight of the day's losses in a manner that Kakashi recognized, watching from a respectful distance, as the particular, permanent kind of growing up that no amount of training could have fully prepared any of them for. Sasuke joined him there eventually, standing a respectful distance away without speaking for a long while, and when he finally did, his voice carried none of its usual guardedness. You didn't hesitate, he said. In the dome. You could have let me handle it alone, and you didn't. You're my teammate, Naruto said simply, as though the explanation required nothing further. That's kind of the whole point of a team, isn't it? Sasuke didn't answer immediately, something working behind his expression that looked, for a rare moment, less like calculation and more like genuine feeling. Thank you, he said finally, quiet enough that Naruto almost missed it, and the two of them stood together at the graveside a while longer, saying nothing further, needing nothing further said. Chapter 11. The bridge, completed weeks later than originally planned but completed nonetheless, was named, at Inari's quiet, insistent suggestion, the Great Naruto Bridge, an honor that left its namesake flushed with an embarrassment considerably more genuine than his usual reaction to praise. You don't have to name a whole bridge after me, he protested, though the protest carried none of his usual conviction, undercut by an obvious, glowing pleasure he couldn't quite hide. You gave this village its hope back, Tsunade said. Seems like a fair trade for a little bit of concrete and steel. The journey home felt different from the journey out, each of the three genin quieter than before, carrying a weight that Kakashi recognized without needing it explained, the particular gravity of a first genuine loss witnessed up close, and the equally particular growth that followed in its wake, unasked for but permanent regardless. Konoha's gates came into view on a bright, unremarkable afternoon, and Naruto broke into a run the moment he spotted two familiar figures waiting just inside them, Tsunade's arms crossed in an attempt at composure that dissolved entirely the instant he closed the distance, and threw himself into a hug she returned with a fierceness that surprised even her. You're all right, she said, checking him over with a medic's practiced, thorough eye even while still holding on. I got Kakashi's preliminary report. Zabuza, Haku, a fight that went considerably further than a C-rank mission should have. Are you actually all right? I'm okay, Naruto said, and meant it, though something in his voice carried a weight it hadn't held before he left. It was rough. Somebody died, Bachan. Somebody I'd actually talked to, who wasn't even really a bad person, not really. I don't really know how to feel about all of it yet. Shizune's hand found his shoulder, steady and warm, exactly as it had been through every difficult conversation of the past 6 years. You don't have to know how to feel about it right away, she said gently. Grief like that takes time to settle into something you understand. We're here for however long that takes. They walked home together, the four of them, and Naruto talked through the mission in careful, halting pieces over the following days, Tsunade and Shizune listening with the same patient attention they'd offered every difficult conversation of his childhood, helping him work through a grief that had nothing to do with training exercises and everything to do with the genuine, permanent cost of the profession he'd chosen. Kakashi visited a week after their return, an unusual gesture that Tsunade greeted with visible surprise, and the conversation that followed, held quietly in the apartment's small kitchen while Naruto trained with Sasuke and Sakura elsewhere, carried a weight neither had quite anticipated when Kakashi first knocked. "He handled himself well," Kakashi said. "Better than well. I've trained under difficult circumstances myself, and I can tell you honestly, what you and Shizune built in him over these past years is remarkable. I wanted you to hear that directly, rather than through a formal mission report that couldn't fully capture it." "Thank you," Tsunade said, something in her posture easing at the unexpected validation. "That means more than you probably realize." Kakashi was quiet for a moment, turning something over before he spoke again, more careful this time. "I should tell you," he said, "that I knew his father? Briefly, but well enough that watching Naruto grow into who he's become carries more weight for me than I've fully let myself examine yet. I'm grateful, genuinely, that he had you both. I'm not certain I could have given him what he needed, not back then, not with everything else the village asked of me." Tsunade studied him for a long moment, understanding settling into place with a quiet, careful gravity. "You still can, you know," she said. "Give him something. It doesn't have to have happened already to matter now." Kakashi's visible eye crinkled, something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps the first careful step toward a debt he'd carried silently for years finally beginning to find its proper shape. He stayed a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier territory, and it was only as he prepared to leave that Tsunade, watching him at the door, found herself asking the question that had been sitting quietly beneath the entire visit. "You said you knew his father well enough that this weighs on you," she said. "Is that a story you're ever planning to tell him?" "When he's ready," Kakashi said. "When I'm ready, if I'm honest. Some truths deserve better timing than a convenient afternoon allows. But I don't intend to let this debt go unpaid forever, Tsunade. He deserves better than that, and so, frankly, does the memory of the man I owe it to." "Then don't wait too long," Tsunade said, not unkindly. "Waiting has a way of turning into permanent silence if you're not careful. I learned that lesson myself, more than once, before I met your student and decided I wasn't willing to make the same mistake a third time." Kakashi nodded, something resolved settling behind his careful, guarded expression, and took his leave with a small, genuine bow that felt, to Tsunade, like the closing of one chapter and the quiet, deliberate opening of another she suspected neither of them fully understood the shape of yet. Chapter 12. Danzo reviewed the complete report of the Wave mission with the same unhurried, careful attention he gave every development touching the Jinchuriki, and found, by its conclusion, that his earlier calculations required a more significant revision than he had initially anticipated. The boy had faced a Jonin-level threat, sustained combat against an opponent operating well beyond typical genin capability, and emerged not merely victorious but transformed by the experience in ways that Danzo's operative described with a precision that left little room for doubt. A shinobi's resolve, hardened rather than shaken by genuine loss, was among the rarest and most valuable qualities a village could hope to cultivate in an asset of this magnitude. He grieved for an enemy, the operative reported, and channeled that grief into growth rather than trauma or hesitation. His teammates report he returned from the mission more disciplined, not less. Whatever foundation Tsunade and Shizune have built in him over these years, it is proving considerably more resilient under genuine pressure than I believe you initially anticipated. Danzo absorbed this in silence, weighing the report against 6 years of patient, careful observation, and arrived, by its end, at a conclusion that unsettled him more than he cared to admit even in the privacy of his own quarters. The boy's loyalty to Tsunade and Shizune, and now, apparently, to a genin team and Jonin sensei he'd only recently acquired, showed no sign of weakening under the pressure Danzo had long assumed would eventually test and fracture it. If anything, each new trial seemed to deepen those bonds rather than strain them, a pattern that ran directly counter to every assumption underlying his years of patient, careful watching. Perhaps, he said, more to himself than to the kneeling operative before him, Hiruzen's faith and attachment was not so misguided after all. It was not, however, a concession that fully settled the matter in his mind. A shinobi's loyalty to individuals, however deep and however resilient, remained, in Danzo's careful, lifelong assessment, a fundamentally different foundation than loyalty to the village as an institution capable of outliving any individual bond, however precious. The Chunin exams, he understood, reviewing the mission calendar with renewed interest, would arrive within the year, an opportunity that would place the boy under scrutiny from every major village in attendance, a stage considerably larger and more consequential than anything Wave's quiet, provincial conflict had offered. Continue observation through the exams, he instructed. And begin, discreetly, an assessment of what other villages might make of the Jinchuriki's growing capability, should word of it travel beyond Konoha's walls. I suspect we are not the only ones who will find the boy's development worth watching closely, once a wider stage presents itself. The operative bowed and withdrew, and Danzo sat alone with the weight of his own careful, patient recalculation, turning over a future that felt, for the first time in 6 years of watching, considerably less certain than his earlier assumptions had promised it would be. Across the village, in an apartment that had long since become, in every meaningful sense, a home, Naruto slept soundly for the first time since returning from Wave, the grief of recent weeks settling, slowly, into something he could carry rather than something that carried him. He did not know, drifting into an easy, dreamless sleep, that a much older, more careful set of eyes had already begun turning its attention toward the larger stage waiting for him ahead, or that the exams gathering on the horizon would test not just his growing strength, but the very bonds that had, over 6 remarkable years, transformed a lonely, overlooked boy into someone the whole village, and soon enough, the wider world beyond it, would find impossible to overlook ever again. In the next room, Tsunade sat awake a while longer, reviewing the events of the past weeks with the same careful attention she brought to every threat that touched the life she'd built with him. Kakashi's visit had left her with more to consider than she'd initially expected, an old debt finally beginning to surface after years of silence, and beneath it, a quieter, more persistent unease that she couldn't fully name yet but recognized, from long experience, as the particular instinct that preceded troubles she hadn't yet identified the shape of. She had learned, over 6 years of raising this particular boy, to trust that instinct more than she once had, and she intended, whatever the coming exams eventually asked of him, to make certain he walked into them as prepared, and as loved, as 6 years of careful, deliberate effort could possibly make him. Thanks for listening.